Nathan Crowley straightened his collar, checked his reflection in the depot window, and walked away. He didn't look back. Not once. Behind him, the westbound train was still rolling to a stop, iron wheels screaming against iron rails. And inside one of those rattling cars, a woman named Margaret Rowan was smoothing her skirt, checking her hair, pressing her lips together to keep from smiling too wide. She had a bag packed with her best dress, a letter folded against her heart, a name she'd practiced saying out loud for 3 months. Nathan. He was already gone, had been gone for 6 days, and she didn't know it yet. If this story already has your heart pounding, you're exactly where we want you. Hit that subscribe button right now, because the story of Margaret Rowan is one you will not want to walk away from halfway through. Every single week we bring you stories like this one, stories about ordinary people who got knocked down hard and chose to get back up anyway. Drop a like, leave a comment with the city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far Margaret's story has traveled. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The letter had smelled like cedar and wood smoke. Margaret Rowan had noticed that the very first time, back in October, when she'd slit open the envelope with her letter knife and pulled out 2 pages of careful, deliberate handwriting, the kind of penmanship a man produces when he's trying hard to make a good impression. She'd stood at the window of her small apartment above the schoolhouse in Mill Haven, Vermont, and read every word twice. Then a third time. Dear Miss Rowan, I am not a man who is easy with words on paper, but I will try to be honest with you because that is the only thing I know how to be. My name is Nathan Crowley. I am 34 years of age. I own a cattle ranch outside Iron Creek, a settlement in the Montana Territory. I lost my wife 2 years ago to fever. I do not want you to feel sorry for me. I am telling you this only so you understand why I am writing to a matchmaking agency at my age. I am not a lonely man by nature, but I am a man who believes in building something real. She had put the letter down, picked it up again. 31 years old, and she'd never received a letter quite like that. Margaret had been practical her whole life, practical the way people become when they grow up watching their mothers stretch pennies and their fathers work jobs that bent them sideways by 50. She'd gotten her teaching certificate at 19, taken her post at Mill Haven at 21, and stayed because staying made sense. She liked children. She liked the smell of chalk dust and the particular satisfaction of watching a slow reader finally crack open a word that had been fighting them for weeks. But she was 31 years old, and the walls of her apartment had started to feel like they were getting closer together. She'd written back to Nathan Crowley, carefully. Without desperation, she was very particular about not sounding desperate. She'd asked him about the land, about the settlement, about what a day on a cattle ranch actually looked like from the inside. She told him about her work, about Vermont winters, about the fact that she preferred coffee to tea and found most poetry too precious for her taste. He'd written back within 2 weeks. Then again, and again, for 4 months. By February, Margaret had a stack of letters 3 inches thick in the bottom drawer of her desk. By March, she knew the names of his ranch hands, the layout of his property, the fact that he took his supper at 5 because working men rise at 4. She knew he'd been trying to learn to bake bread and failing badly at it. She knew he'd grown up in Ohio, moved west at 22, built the ranch from raw land over 12 years. She thought she knew him. That was the part that would take her the longest to forgive herself for. It was his letter in late March that changed everything. Miss Rowan, Margaret. I have been thinking about this for some time, and I believe I have been thinking around it instead of toward it, which is a habit I'm trying to break. So I will say it plainly. I would like you to come to Iron Creek. I would like us to meet as people who have agreed on something serious, not as strangers. I have spoken to Reverend Alcott here in town. He has agreed to perform a ceremony in late April if we decide that is what we both want after meeting. I understand this is a large thing to ask. I understand you have a life there. I am not asking you to give it up lightly. But I am asking. Margaret had sat with that letter for 4 days. Then she'd walked into the schoolhouse principal's office and given her resignation. The principal, a humorless man named Gerald Pruitt, had stared at her over his spectacles like she'd suggested setting the building on fire. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a man rearranging his opinion of someone. "I am," Margaret said, "for a man you've never met. For a life I've never had. Pruitt had looked at her the way people look at someone doing something they privately want to do but can't justify doing themselves. Somewhere between judgment and envy. He'd accepted her resignation without warmth. She'd sold her furniture to a neighbor woman named Clara Hobbs, who'd been eyeing the armchair for 2 years. She'd sold most of her books, kept only 7, the ones she truly couldn't part with. She'd packed 2 trunks, bought a train ticket that swallowed most of her remaining savings, written Nathan Crowley a letter telling him her arrival date, the time, the train line. He had written back, "I'll be at the station. I'll be the one holding my hat in both hands because I expect I'll be nervous. Nathan." She'd read that line probably 40 times on the train west. He'd be holding his hat in both hands. She'd looked for that. When the train finally groaned into Iron Creek's small depot on the afternoon of April 22nd, she'd pressed her face to the window and looked for a man holding his hat. The platform was maybe 30 feet of weathered boards, a station master, 2 women talking to each other, a boy of about 12 sitting on a crate, no one holding a hat. She'd told herself he was late. Men ran late. It didn't mean anything. She'd gotten off the train with both her trunks and her traveling bag and stood on that platform while the other passengers collected themselves and dispersed. And she'd waited. The train had pulled out. The platform had gone quiet. The station master, a round-faced man with red cheeks and a distracted expression, had started sweeping. She'd waited 45 minutes before she walked over to him. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm looking for a man named Nathan Crowley. He owns a ranch outside town. Do you know him?" The station master stopped sweeping. He had the look of someone who'd just been handed an unexpected problem he didn't want. "Ma'am," he said, Are you the woman from Vermont?" Something in the way he said it made her stomach drop. Not the words. The tone. The careful, walking on ice quality of it. "I am," she said. Margaret Rowan. The station master set his broom carefully against the wall. He took off his cap and held it in both hands. And there was something horribly ironic about that. She would think about it later. She would think about it at 3 in the morning more times than she could count. "Miss Rowan," he said, "Nathan Crowley sold his ranch 9 days ago. He left Iron Creek, far as anyone knows, maybe 6, 7 days back. Nobody's heard from him since." The world didn't tilt or spin. It simply went very, very still. "I see," she said. She didn't say anything else for a moment. She was very focused on not letting her face do what it wanted to do. "Was there," she started, stopped, tried again. "Did he leave any message? With anyone in town? Anything addressed to me?" "Not that I've heard, ma'am. I'm sorry." She nodded. She thanked him. She picked up her bag and walked to the bench at the end of the platform and sat down and looked at the mountains in the distance, big, indifferent, snow-capped, and breathed through her nose slowly and deliberately. 4 months of letters. Every word of them in the bottom of her trunk right now. She had approximately $14. She had no job, no apartment, no return ticket home. The teaching position she'd given up had already been filled. Gerald Pruitt had moved quickly, she'd heard before she left. She had 7 books, 2 trunks, and a traveling bag. And she was sitting on a train platform in a territory that was essentially the far edge of the known world, as far as Millhaven, Vermont was concerned. She sat there long enough that the station master came back out and cleared his throat. "Miss Rowan, there's a hotel in town. Delaney's. Mrs. Delaney is a decent woman. She'd give you a fair rate." "Thank you," Margaret said. She didn't move yet. "You got someone you can wire? Family somewhere?" She thought about that. Her mother, in a small house in Barr, Vermont, who had a bad hip and had been quietly horrified by the whole plan from the beginning, but had kept her mouth shut out of respect. Her brother Thomas in Boston, who had a young family and tight finances, and who had said, "Maggie, are you sure about this?" in the specific tone that meant, "Please don't do this." She thought about calling either of them for help. "I'll be fine," she said. "Thank you." She picked up her bag. She found a boy near the depot who agreed to haul her trunks to Delaney's hotel for 25 cents. She walked through the main street of Iron Creek. which was exactly what you'd expect of a frontier settlement. Mud in the street, wooden storefronts, a smell of horses and sawdust and meat smoke, and tried to think. Not about Nathan Crowley. Not yet. If she thought about Nathan Crowley right now, she would either start screaming or start crying, and she was not going to do either of those things on a public street. She thought about the $14. She thought about what she was good at. She thought about whether she could make those two things connect somehow. Delaney's hotel was a 2-story building with a porch that needed repair and curtains in the windows that had probably been cheerful once. A bell above the door rang when she pushed it open. The woman behind the counter was in her 50s, broad-shouldered, with iron gray hair pulled back tight and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She looked at Margaret, really looked at her, the way perceptive people look at someone who's just been through something they're not talking about yet. "Help you?" the woman said. "I need a room," Margaret said. "I need to know your rate and whether there's any work in this town that a school teacher might be qualified to do." The woman's eyebrows went up slightly. "You're the Vermont woman. Word travels fast. Small town." The woman set down her pencil. "I'm May Delaney. Nathan Crowley's a rotten piece of work, and I'm sorry about what happened to you. The room is 50 cents a night, breakfast included." Margaret exhaled slowly. "Thank you for saying that directly. I find direct saves time." May Delaney pulled a key from a hook on the wall. "As for work, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I'll think on it." The room was small and clean and had a window that looked out onto the side street. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and finally let herself count the money. $14.30. 28 nights at Delaney's hotel, if she ate nothing. Less than that, realistically. She sat there with the money in her hands and thought, I could go home. She could wire Thomas. She could spend one of those dollars on a telegram asking him to send the price of a return ticket. He'd do it. Thomas would grumble and say, "I told you," in some form or another, but he'd do it because he was her brother. She could go back to Millhaven, try to find another teaching post, tell as few people as possible what had happened, let the humiliation quietly scar over. She sat with that option for a solid 5 minutes. Then she folded the money back up and put it in her purse. She wasn't going home. She wasn't sure yet what she was going to do. But she wasn't going back to be pitied in a town where everyone already knew her, and she wasn't going to let Nathan Crowley's cowardice define the next 30 years of her life. She went downstairs to dinner that night and sat alone at a corner table, and the other guests, a traveling merchant and a couple passing through, were careful not to stare too obviously. May Delaney brought her a plate of beef stew that was better than it had any right to be, and a cup of coffee without being asked. "You're not what I expected," May said, standing by the table for a moment. "What did you expect?" "More crying," May said. "No offense." "None taken." Margaret looked at the stew. "I may still get there, but probably not in the dining room." May made a short sound that might have been a laugh. "Fair enough." Margaret ate. The stew was genuinely good. The coffee was strong the way frontier coffee always was, like it had something to prove. The next morning she was up before 6. She asked May Delaney where a person might find a job in Iron Creek, and May gave her a realistic tour of the options. The general store wasn't hiring, the schoolhouse had a teacher already. There wasn't much else unless she wanted to cook or clean. "There's the ranches," May said, refilling Margaret's coffee. "Some of the bigger operations hire for household management, cooking, keeping, that sort of thing. It's not glamorous." "I'm not looking for glamorous," Margaret said. She spent the morning walking the town. She spoke to the man at the general store, a lean, quiet individual named Harker, who confirmed there was nothing available but mentioned that Silas Boone out at the Boone Ranch had been running short-staffed since his housekeeper left in January. "Silas Boone," Margaret said. "What's he like?" Harker considered that the way people consider questions that have complicated answers. "Decent man," he finally said. "Hard to know. Lost his wife about 2 years back, has a boy, 6 years old. The ranch is sound, or was, before things started slipping." "And why did his housekeeper leave?" Another pause. "She said the boy was difficult. I think she found the work lonelier than she expected." Margaret thanked him and walked back out onto the street. She was standing in front of the general store, thinking about what a 6-year-old boy who'd lost his mother might be like to work around, when she heard it, a sound she knew the way she knew the sound of a chalk breaking against a slate board. A child crying. Not a tantrum, not a frustration cry. The specific thin, bewildered crying of a child who is lost and doesn't entirely understand how lost they are. She turned around. There was a small boy sitting in the mud at the edge of the street, approximately halfway between the general store and the livery stable. He was maybe 5 or 6 years old, dark-haired, wearing clothes that were clean but not well cared for, the way children's clothes look when someone is washing them but not really attending to them. He was sitting in the mud not because he'd fallen, as far as she could tell, but because he'd simply stopped walking and sat down, the way children sometimes do when they are overwhelmed and their legs make the decision before their mind does. She crossed the street. She crouched down in front of him. He was crying in that too quiet way that meant he'd been at it for a while. "Hey," she said. Not "it's all right," because she hated when adults said that to children who were clearly not all right. Just, "Hey," like she was meeting him somewhere honest. The boy looked up. His eyes were dark and red-rimmed, and he had mud on one cheek, and he looked at her for one long, bare second. And then something happened in his face that she couldn't have predicted and wasn't prepared for. His expression cracked open completely. All of it, every wall a 6-year-old builds. "Mama," he said, and he threw himself into her arms so hard it nearly knocked her backward. She caught him. She didn't know what else to do. He was small and solid and shaking slightly, and he had his face buried against her neck, and he was saying it again, quietly, like a thing he'd been keeping inside for a long time. "Mama, mama, mama." Margaret Rowan, who had not cried once since stepping off that train, felt something tighten in her chest so sharply it was almost physical. She held the boy. She put one hand on the back of his head the way she'd seen mothers do it. She'd watched it thousands of times, had always known the gesture theoretically. And she held him while he shook. She didn't correct him. She knew she should. She would have to, eventually. But not in this moment, in the mud, in the street, while his whole small body was desperate for something she didn't have the heart to refuse. She was still holding him. Maybe 2 minutes had passed, maybe 3, when she felt the shadow fall across them both and looked up. The man standing there was tall, broad through the shoulders, with weathered hands and a face that had been outdoors in all weathers for a long time. He wasn't old, mid-30s maybe, but he had the look of someone who'd been through enough to put years on him that the calendar hadn't. He was staring at her and the boy with an expression she couldn't read at first. Then she understood what it was. He was trying very hard not to react to something that was hitting him somewhere he didn't want to be hit. "Eli," the man said. His voice was quiet and even. "Eli, come here." The boy, Eli, tightened his grip on Margaret's coat. "Eli." Softer this time. Margaret loosened her arms carefully. "It's all right," she said to the boy, quietly, close to his ear. "I'm not going anywhere." She didn't know why she said that. It slipped out. She helped the boy stand. He wiped his face on his sleeve and looked at the man, then back at Margaret, then at the man again, like he was checking to see if the situation was about to become a problem. The man looked at Margaret. Up close, his eyes were the color of creek water in October. He wasn't looking at her with hostility. He was looking at her with that particular careful attention of someone who is trying to figure out what kind of person they're dealing with. "Are you the woman from Vermont?" he asked. She was beginning to wonder if everyone in Iron Creek was going to ask her that. "Yes," she said. She straightened up and held out her hand. "Margaret Rowan." He looked at her hand, shook it. "Silas Boone." "Of course." "Your son is very fast," she said. "He got to me before I'd had a chance to see him coming." Something moved through Silas Boone's face. Not quite humor, but in that neighborhood. "That's one word for it." He looked down at Eli, who was now standing close to Margaret with his hand hovering very near her sleeve without quite touching it, like a question he hadn't decided to ask yet. "Eli, what have I told you about running off?" "Not to," the boy said. He sounded about as guilty as a 6-year-old can sound, which is not very. "Then why—" "I saw her," Eli said simply. "She looked like Mama." The silence after that landed hard on all 3 of them. Silas Boone looked at Margaret again. She met his gaze and didn't look away because she didn't know what to do with her eyes, and looking away seemed worse. He does that sometimes, Silas said. It was said with the particular flatness of someone who is embarrassed by something that he also knows isn't his fault. I'm sorry if he frightened you. He didn't, Margaret said, which was true. Silas picked his hat up and turned it in his hands. And there was that motion again, that motion. I'll be holding my hat in both hands because I expect I'll be nervous. And she pushed that thought down hard because this was an entirely different man and an entirely different situation, and she was not going to map one onto the other. I heard about Crowley, Silas said. What he did? Word travels fast, she said again. It does. He seemed to weigh something. I also heard you've been asking about work. She looked at him steadily. I have. Silas Boone looked at his son, who was now unambiguously holding on to Margaret's sleeve. He looked at the state of his own hands, calloused, rough, the hands of someone who had been managing too many things at once and not managing any of them particularly well. I need somebody for the household, he said. Cooking, keeping the place running. It's not an easy situation. The work is hard and the pay is... He named a figure. It wasn't generous, but it was real. You'd have room and board on top of that. Margaret did the arithmetic. It wasn't remarkable money, but it was more than $14 stretched across 28 nights. When would you need me to start? She said. He looked at her. At Eli. At her again. Tomorrow? He said. And it came out slightly uncertain, like he was surprised to be asking, like he'd expected her to negotiate or refuse or flinch. She didn't flinch. All right, Margaret Rowan said. Tomorrow. Eli Boone, who was 6 years old and had lost his mother and had been waiting, in the wordless way children wait, for something he couldn't name to come back, reached out and took Margaret's hand. She let him hold it, and something settled in Iron Creek, in the quiet between one thing ending and another thing not yet having a name. Part 2. A Stranger's Ranch, A Child's Mistake. The Boone Ranch was 4 miles outside Iron Creek, and the wagon ride out there the next morning told Margaret more about Silas Boone than anything he could have said. He didn't talk. Not out of rudeness, she got the sense early that he wasn't a rude man, but out of habit. He was a man who'd gotten used to silence and had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the smell of a place you live in. Eli sat between them on the wagon bench, pressed against Margaret's side with the easy confidence of a child who had already made a decision and was not interested in reconsidering it. He asked her 4 questions in the first mile. What was her favorite color? Did she know how to make biscuits? Had she ever seen a real bear? And did she think his dog Chester was the best dog in the whole territory? I haven't met Chester yet, Margaret said. He is, though, Eli said, with the certainty of someone stating a geographical fact. Silas said nothing, but she caught, from the corner of her eye, the slight relaxation around his jaw. Not a smile. Something one step behind a smile. The ranch came into view as they crested a low hill, and Margaret took it in without comment. The main house was solid. She could see that. The bones of it were good. But it had the look of a place that had been running on maintenance alone for a while, with nothing left over for improvement. The porch railing had a section missing. The kitchen garden alongside the house was overgrown into something between a garden and a surrender. There was a barn in better shape than the house, which told her where Silas Boone's priorities had been living. She didn't say any of this. She climbed down from the wagon, picked up her bag, and said, "Show me the kitchen." Silas looked at her for a half-second, like he'd expected something else, some kind of reaction to the state of things. Then he led her inside. The kitchen was worse than the outside. Not dirty, she could tell someone had been making efforts, but disorganized in the specific way of a man who had never had to run a kitchen and was operating entirely on guesswork. There were pots in the wrong places and staples stored without logic, and the wood box beside the stove was half empty, which told her mornings had been cold and slow. "Who's been cooking?" she asked. "Me," Silas said, "and one of the ranch hands, Pete, when I can't. And Eli's been eating." "Well enough," Silas said, slightly defensive. "I'm not criticizing," Margaret said. "I'm taking inventory." He looked at her again with that unreadable expression. Then he left her to it. She spent the first hour just looking. The pantry, the root cellar, the state of the linens, the stove's temperament. Every house had a personality, and you had to find it before you could work with it or against it. This house was tired. It had been cared for once, properly, and then the person who'd cared for it had gone, and everything since had been a slow exhale. She understood that. She found a bucket and filled it from the pump outside and started on the kitchen floor, because the floor was where everything else started. Eli found her 20 minutes later, crouched in the doorway watching her work with the intense focus children bring to things they find genuinely interesting. "What you doing?" he said. "Scrubbing." "How come?" "Because it needs it." He thought about this. Papa tried to scrub it once. He knocked the bucket over. "That happens," Margaret said. "He said a bad word," Eli offered. "That also happens." Eli giggled. A short, surprised sound, like he hadn't meant to. Margaret kept scrubbing. She could feel him still watching. "Are you going to stay?" he asked. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest in an unconscious imitation of the way she'd seen his father stand, and his face was asking the question more seriously than a 6-year-old's face should have to ask anything. "For now," she said. Honest. Not of course or yes forever, things she couldn't promise. "For now, I'm here." He seemed to turn this over. "Okay," he said finally, and went to find his dog. The first week was hard in the specific way that all new situations are hard. Not catastrophic, just grinding. The stove had a personality defect that meant it ran hot on the left side and needed compensating for. The ranch hands, there were 3 of them, Pete and a broad man called Dutch, and a younger one named Calhoun, who was maybe 19 and tried very hard not to be caught looking at her, were polite enough but watchful in the way people are watchful around a woman they've been told is a mail-order bride who got abandoned at the station. She could feel the story preceding her everywhere she went on that property. She didn't address it directly. She made food. She made it on time, and she made it well, because that was the language this world spoke, and she was fluent enough. By Wednesday of the first week, Pete, who was maybe 60, with the permanent squint of a man who'd spent 4 decades in outdoor light, and the disposition of someone who had decided long ago that most things were not worth getting excited about, came into the kitchen after supper and said, "That was the best beef stew I've had in about 8 months." "May Delaney's is better," Margaret said. She was washing dishes. "May Delaney doesn't cook for us," Pete said, and walked out. That was, she understood, a significant statement. Silas ate his meals at the table with Eli and said almost nothing that wasn't practical. "The roof on the second chicken coop needs attention. There's a supply run to town Thursday if you need anything added to the list." He was not unfriendly. He was not friendly. He occupied a careful middle space that she recognized as the posture of a man who had been managing his own grief by keeping very busy and very quiet, and did not quite know what to do now that someone had come in and begun to change the texture of his daily life. She didn't push. She had her own managing to do. At night, in the small but adequate room they'd given her off the kitchen, she took out Nathan Crowley's letters. Not to read, she'd stopped being able to read them, but to look at them, the stack of them. She was still in the process of converting the fact of what he'd done from something she felt in her stomach into something she could think about coldly, with her brain instead of her gut. It was slow work. She knew she'd have to deal with it. With the money she'd spent, with what she'd left behind, with the particular open wound of having trusted someone completely based on paper and ink, and the hope that a person who writes that carefully about honesty must mean it. But that was for later. Tonight there was the stove to check, and Eli to see to in the morning, and a kitchen garden that needed rescuing before the growing season ran out entirely. She put the letters away and went to sleep. The garden was her first real fight with the ranch, and she won it on a Saturday morning in early May with a hoe she found in the barn and 2 hours of pure obstinate work while Eli sat on the fence and provided commentary. "That's a weed," he said helpfully, pointing. "I know." "That one too." "I know." "What about Eli?" she said, not looking up. "If you name one more weed, I'm going to ask you to come help me pull them." Silence. Then, "Papa says I pull up the good plants by accident." Then maybe, Margaret said, you should learn which ones are which. He climbed down from the fence and came to stand beside her. She handed him the smaller trowel she'd found. He looked at it with the careful expression of someone taking on a serious responsibility. She spent the next hour teaching him the difference between what belonged in that garden and what was trying to take it over. He got it wrong twice and right 3 times and seemed genuinely proud of the 3. By the time they were done, he was muddy up to his elbows, and the garden had gone from chaos to something that might actually produce food by July. Silas came around the side of the house while they were washing up at the pump and stopped at the side of the garden. He looked at it for a long time without saying anything. It needed doing, Margaret said. I know it did. He still hadn't looked away from the garden. Yeah. He seemed to realize he hadn't finished the sentence. Thank you, he said. Simple. Direct. Like the words cost him something, but he decided to spend them anyway. Eli helped, she said. Silas looked at his son, who was covered in mud and very pleased about it. Something moved across his face, complicated, private. Good, he said quietly. That was the first time Margaret thought that Silas Boone might, under the careful managed surface, be someone she could actually work alongside. Not just for. Alongside. The trouble started, as trouble in small towns almost always does, with a woman at the general store. It was the second Thursday when Margaret came in with the supply list. There were 2 women near the counter, one about her age, one older, and they'd stopped talking when she walked in, which was itself a kind of talking. Harker, behind the counter, greeted her normally enough, but she could feel the women watching her the way you feel a draft from a window that isn't quite closed. She gathered her list items. She was nearly done when the younger woman, brown hair, sharp eyes, the look of someone who has appointed herself the keeper of community standards, said, "You're the one out at the Boone place now." "I am," Margaret said. She didn't stop what she was doing. That sound, that specific woman sound that contains an entire editorial. How is that working out for you? Well, thank you. I only ask, the woman said, because it's an unusual arrangement, a single woman living on a widower's ranch. She paused to let that land. People talk. People do, Margaret agreed pleasantly. She handed Harker the list. I just think, the woman continued, that a woman in your position might want to think about how things look, given the circumstances of how you arrived. Margaret turned around then, fully, and looked at the woman with the particular steady attention she had once used on students who were testing to see exactly how far they could push before something happened. My position, Margaret said, is employed, which is more than I had a week ago, and I intend to keep it. She paused. Is there something specific you'd like to say to me? Because I find I prefer direct to suggestive. The woman blinked. The older woman beside her had the expression of someone watching a chess move she hadn't anticipated. No, the younger woman said after a moment. No, I suppose not. Good, Margaret said, and turned back to Harker, who was very carefully looking at his ledger. Outside, loading the wagon, she sat with the adrenaline of it for a moment, because that had felt right, standing her ground, but she also knew what it would cost her. You don't embarrass a woman like that in a small town without consequences. The whispers would get louder before they got quieter. She'd have to be better than the whispers. That was the only answer she'd ever found to that particular problem. She drove back to the ranch and said nothing to Silas about it. He didn't need to manage her social difficulties on top of everything else. But that evening, after supper, when Eli was in bed and she was at the kitchen table with a list she was making of things that still needed attention in the house, Silas came in and poured himself coffee and sat down across from her without being invited, which was unusual. He normally moved through his own house like a guest. "Loretta Marsh give you trouble in town today?" he asked. She looked up. "Who told you?" "Harker. He mentions things." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. She and some others have been saying things about the arrangement here." "I know," Margaret said. "I can speak to her husband." "Please don't," Margaret said. "That'll make it worse, and also it's not your problem to solve." He looked at her steadily. "It's happening because of my ranch. It's happening because some people need a story to fill the silence, and I'm a convenient one. She went back to her list. I've dealt with women like Loretta Marsh before. Give me time. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you're not what I expected. She glanced up. What did you expect? He seemed to think about how honest to be. Someone more defeated, he said finally, after what Crowley did. The name landed on the table between them like something dropped. I was, she said carefully. On that platform for about 40 minutes, I was thoroughly defeated. She looked at her list. Then I decided I wasn't interested in it. Silas said nothing for a moment. Then he said, He's done it before. Crowley. She went very still. What do you mean? It wasn't a question. The way she said it wasn't a question. Silas wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. I've been asking around since you got here. I know a man in Billings who trades in news from across the territory, and he says there was a woman in Wyoming 2 years back. Similar story. Letters, agreement to marry, she arrived and he was gone. He'd sold property there too. The kitchen was very quiet. How many? Margaret said. I don't know yet, Silas said, but I don't think you're the first. She sat with that. She felt something happen in her chest. Not grief, exactly. Rage, maybe, but a cold kind, the useful kind that doesn't burn itself out, but settles in and sharpens. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Silas Boone looked directly at her. Because I thought you'd want to know what kind of man you were actually dealing with. She held his gaze. And what kind of man is he, in your opinion? The kind, Silas said, who picks women who have something to lose and won't make noise, who calculate what they can take before anyone notices. He paused. I think he miscalculated with you. She didn't say anything for a long moment. I think, she said finally, that you might be right about that. She closed her notebook and went to bed, but she didn't sleep for a long time. She lay in the dark thinking about Wyoming, about some other woman on some other platform, smoothing her skirt, looking for a man holding his hat, about how Nathan Crowley had walked away from all of them with their money and their trust and their best dress packed carefully in a trunk, and he had never once, not once, looked back. The cold rage settled lower, deeper. She would need to think about what to do with it, but not tonight. In the days that followed, she found her rhythm on the ranch, and it surprised her how much that helped. There's a particular grace in useful work, not glamorous, not noticed, just necessary. And she'd always understood that kind of work in a way she suspected not everyone did. She fixed what was fixable. She asked Pete about the things she didn't know, and he answered without making her feel stupid for asking, which raised him considerably in her estimation. The missing section of porch railing had been bothering her since the first day. She found the lumber in the barn. She'd watched her father fix enough things in enough houses to have a rough working knowledge of how repair worked, even if her hands weren't practiced at it. Dutch found her on the porch with a hammer on a Wednesday afternoon and stopped walking like he'd run into something invisible. Ma'am, he said carefully. Dutch, she said. She held out a board. Hold this end. He held it. He seemed unsure of his situation, but too surprised to argue. They fixed the railing in 40 minutes. He didn't say much during it, but when they were done, he looked at the railing and then at her with an expression that was recalibrating something. You do a lot of things yourself, he said. I find it faster, she said. He nodded slowly. Pete said you were different. Different from what? From what we expected, Dutch said, and walked away. She thought about that later, what we expected. She understood what they'd expected, a desperate woman in over her head, needing management, causing problems. Someone to accommodate. She wasn't that, and they were all in the process of figuring out what she actually was and how to relate to it. Fine. She could wait. Eli, for his part, had attached himself to her with the particular unselfconscious completeness of a young child who has made a decision and sees no reason to revisit it. He was at her side in the mornings while she organized the kitchen. He reported on Chester's activities throughout the day with the regularity of a correspondent filing dispatches. He brought her things, interesting rocks, a feather, once a dead beetle that he found remarkable, with the offering instinct of a child who equates gift-giving with belonging. She accepted everything. She examined the beetles seriously. "That's a good one," she said. Eli beamed. What she was less prepared for were the moments at night when he'd come padding out of his room in his socks because he'd had a bad dream and stand in the kitchen doorway with his blanket dragging on the floor and look at her with a look that was asking something she wasn't sure she had the right to answer. The first time it happened, she'd made him warm milk. She'd read once that it helped children sleep. She didn't know if it was true, but it gave them both something to do. And sat with him at the table until the look faded and he got heavy-eyed again. She'd walked him back to his room and stood in the doorway until he was settled. Going back to her own room, she'd passed Silas's door and seen the line of light under it. Awake. He'd heard. He'd let her handle it, which meant he'd made a decision to let her, and she wasn't sure what to do with that information. She stood in the hallway for a moment, then she went back to her room and pulled Nathan Crowley's letters out again. Not to read, not even really to look at. Just to remind herself of the actual shape of the thing she was dealing with. A stack of paper. A man who'd written carefully and lied carefully and walked away carefully. She put them back in the drawer and lay down in the dark. She thought about what Silas had told her. Another woman in Wyoming. Maybe more. She thought about the way Nathan had written. "I am not a man who is easy with words on paper, but I will try to be honest with you." He was easy with words on paper. That was the thing. He was very, very easy with them. And somewhere out there, he was probably being easy with words on paper for someone else. That thought propelled her out of bed. She went to the small desk in her room, and by lamplight she began to write. A letter to the matchmaking agency in Vermont that had first connected her to Nathan Crowley, asking for any information about how he had presented himself to them. A letter to May Delaney, asking if she knew the name of the town in Wyoming Silas had mentioned. A letter to Thomas in Boston, not asking for help, just telling him she was alive and employed and that he should not worry, though she knew he would. She wrote until the lamp began to gutter. Then she organized the letters by priority and set them aside to send from town. The following Tuesday, she drove into town alone for the first time since her exchange with Loretta Marsh, and she was braced for it. What she found instead was something more complicated. May Delaney flagged her down outside the hotel with an expression that mixed concern and something sharper. "Someone's been asking after you," May said. Margaret stopped walking. "Who?" "Man came in on the afternoon stage. 2 days ago." May lowered her voice, even though they were essentially alone on the porch. "Gave his name as Coleman. Said he was a lawyer out of Helena. Said he was trying to locate a Margaret Rowan in connection with a legal matter." Everything in Margaret's body went cold, and then very, very still. "A legal matter," she said. "That's what he said." May was watching her face. "You know what it's about?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She was thinking. She was thinking about Wyoming, and about a man who picked women who wouldn't make noise, and about what it meant that instead of staying gone, there was now a lawyer in Iron Creek asking for her. "I have an idea," she said. "Whatever it is," May said, "you might want to plan before that lawyer finds you. He'll be back. He said he'd return in a few days." Margaret straightened her shoulders. She thought about the porch railing, the garden, the kitchen floor, the things she'd fixed because they needed fixing, and she was there, and she was capable, and there was no particular reason to wait for someone else to do it. "Good," she said. "That gives me time." "Time for what?" May asked. Margaret looked down the street, past the general store, past the depot where she'd sat on a bench with $14 in her hands and seriously considered going home. "To get ready," she said. May looked at her for a long moment. "Nathan Crowley's behind this, isn't he?" "Most likely." "Then he's a fool," May said flatly, because he clearly didn't take a good enough look at who he was running from. Margaret said nothing to that, but she felt something settle in her, something with edges. She mailed her letters. She bought the supplies she'd come for. She drove back out to the ranch in the late afternoon with the sun throwing long shadows across the road and her mind turning the problem over in every direction. She was still at the kitchen table that evening, writing in her notebook. Not recipes, not household lists, but names and dates and everything she could remember from every letter Nathan had ever sent her, organized by what could be verified and what couldn't. When Silas came in for the second time in a week and sat down across from her. He looked at what she was doing, at the neat columns of handwriting. "The lawyer," he said. She looked up. "You heard? Pete was in town. Word gets back." He put his forearms on the table. "What does Crowley want?" "I don't know yet," Margaret said. "But a man who runs from something doesn't send a lawyer back to it unless he's trying to control what happens next." "Trying to discredit you," Silas said, "before anyone starts asking questions." "That's my read." Silas was quiet for a moment. He looked at her notebook. "What are you doing?" "Building something," she said. He looked at her steadily. "You need anything? Help with it?" She held his gaze. In the lamplight, he looked less armored than he did in the daylight hours, and she thought that was probably true for both of them after dark, when the business of the day ran out and what was left was just the actual person. "Yes," she said, "I need to know who you contacted in Billings, and I need to know if there's a judge in this territory who runs a fair courtroom." Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Judge Harlan Reeves in Clearwater, 30 miles east. He's the fairest man in 3 territories as far as I've seen." "Good," Margaret said, and wrote the name down. Eli appeared in the kitchen doorway in his socks with his blanket, his hair catastrophically sideways, no bad dream behind his eyes this time. Just the specific wake-up that children do when something interesting is happening. "What are you doing?" he said. "Working," Margaret and Silas said simultaneously, in exactly the same tone. They looked at each other. Eli looked between them. "Okay," he said, with the philosophical acceptance of a 6-year-old who has encountered things he doesn't understand before and recovered from them. He pulled his blanket tighter. "Can I have water?" "Yes," Margaret said. She got up and poured him a cup and walked him back to his room and stood in the doorway until he settled, the way she'd been doing it, the way it had become something she did now without deciding to do it. When she came back to the kitchen, Silas was still at the table, and he'd refilled her coffee without being asked. She sat back down. She picked up her pen. Outside, the Montana night was very large and very dark, and the ranch sat in it the way small human things sit in large dark places. Small, warm, lit from within, holding on. She wrote down everything she knew about Nathan Crowley. It was more than he had thought she knew. That, she suspected, was his first mistake. Part 3. The Predator Returns. The lawyer's name was Edmund Coleman, and he arrived at the Boone Ranch on a Thursday morning without warning, which Margaret suspected was intentional. She was at the pump filling a bucket when the buggy came up the road, and she watched it come without moving. A man in a dark coat and a hat that cost more than anything else in Iron Creek. He had the look of city money, soft hands, careful posture, the ease of someone who had spent his whole career in rooms where he held the advantage. He pulled up near the porch and climbed down and looked around the ranch with the particular expression of a man cataloging what he sees for future use. "Miss Rowan," he said. Not a question. He'd known she was the one at the pump. "Mr. Coleman," she said. He paused. "You know who I am." "May Delaney mentioned you were asking after me." She set the bucket down and wiped her hands on her apron. "What do you want?" He smiled. It was a professional smile, produced, not felt. "Perhaps somewhere we could speak privately." "We can speak here," Margaret said. Something adjusted behind his eyes. She'd declined the indoors, which meant she'd declined the subtle shift in power that came with sitting across a desk from a lawyer in a contained space. He'd expected her to invite him in. He'd planned for that. He adjusted. "My client, Mr. Nathan Crowley, has asked me to inform you that he intends to bring a civil action against you for breach of the marriage agreement entered into between the 2 parties in correspondence dated—" "Stop," Margaret said. He stopped. "You rode 4 miles out from town," she said, "to tell me that Nathan Crowley is suing me for breach of a marriage agreement that he himself abandoned by leaving this territory before I arrived." Coleman kept his expression even. "The terms of the agreement, as my client understands them—" "There was no agreement," Margaret said. "There were letters. His letters made representations about his property, his intentions, and his presence in this town that turned out to be entirely false. He sold his ranch and disappeared. I have witnesses to the state of this town when I arrived. I have his letters." She tilted her head slightly. "Does your client know I kept every letter he sent me?" A pause. Brief, But there. My client is prepared to pursue this matter in— Where is he? Margaret said. I'm not at liberty to— Mr. Coleman. She kept her voice level. You rode out here expecting a frightened woman with no resources and no one in her corner. I understand that. It's a reasonable assumption given what your client told you about me. She picked up the bucket. Tell Nathan Crowley that if he wants to have this conversation in a courtroom, I will be there, and I will be prepared. Coleman looked at her for a long moment. He had the look now of a man who had been given a job that he was realizing was more complicated than advertised. You'll be hearing from me officially, he said. I expect so, Margaret said, and walked back toward the house. She made it to the kitchen before her hands started shaking. She set the bucket down carefully and put both hands flat on the table and breathed through her nose the way she'd taught herself to do on the train platform, slow and deliberate, until the shaking passed. Then she sat down and wrote 3 letters in 1 hour. The first was to the matchmaking agency in Vermont. She'd already sent one, but this one was different. This one asked specifically for copies of the original correspondence Nathan Crowley had submitted to register with the agency. His self-description, his claimed property holdings, his stated intentions. The second was to a woman named Clara Hobbs back in Millhaven, the neighbor who'd bought her armchair, asking her to go to the post office and retrieve any mail that had arrived at Margaret's old address in the past month, because she'd been expecting something from a contact in Billings and wasn't sure if she'd given the right forwarding address. The third was to Thomas in Boston. This one she sat with for a while before she wrote it. Thomas was a lawyer. Not a frontier lawyer, a real one, with a proper firm and 3 years of practice behind him. She hadn't wanted to ask him. She'd been very deliberate about not asking him, because asking Thomas for help meant admitting the full shape of the situation, and she'd been managing the situation so far by keeping it just slightly smaller than its actual size in her own mind. She wrote the letter anyway. She told him everything. The letters, the platform, Crowley's disappearance, the other woman in Wyoming that Silas had mentioned, Coleman's visit this morning. She laid it out plainly, the way she'd learned to write. Without decoration, without softening, just the facts in order. She told him she wasn't asking him to fix it. She was asking him to tell her if she was thinking about it correctly. She sealed all 3 letters and went to find Pete. I need to get to town, she said. Pete looked at her face. He was good at reading faces, she'd noticed. It was the kind of skill that developed in a man who had spent decades around animals and other working men, both of which communicated mainly through expression and posture. I'll drive you, he said. He didn't ask what it was about. In town, she mailed the letters. Then she went to see May Delaney. May was behind the hotel counter with her reading glasses on, doing accounts in a large ledger, and she looked up when Margaret came in and immediately took off her glasses. Coleman went out to the ranch, May said. He did, Margaret said. She sat down in the chair across the counter. May, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. When have I been anything else? Did Nathan Crowley, in the time he was in Iron Creek, did he ever say anything specific about me? About our arrangement? Anything that seemed off to you at the time? May was quiet for a moment. She put her glasses on the counter and turned them over once. He came in for supper most nights, she said carefully. He talked about the ranch, about the sale. He'd been planning to sell for some time. That wasn't a surprise. What he didn't talk about was you. Not really. Men who are genuinely expecting someone to arrive tend to mention it, tend to be nervous about it. She paused. Nathan Crowley was the opposite of nervous. Margaret sat with that. He was calm, she said. Entirely, May said. The way a man is calm when he's already made his decision and he's just waiting for the timing to work out right. Something clicked into place in Margaret's mind. Not new information. She'd suspected this, or something like it. But hearing it said plainly by someone who'd watched it happen made it real in a different way. He was never going to be there, Margaret said. The arrival date, the plan. He was using it, using the timeline. Using what about the timeline? May asked. He needed to be gone before I arrived, but he also needed the ranch sale to close before he left. She stopped, worked through it. I was the distraction. While he was courting me in letters, he was negotiating the property sale. The correspondence gave him a reason to stay in town longer than a man who was just selling up and leaving. People expected him to stay because he was waiting for someone. May was very still. The agency fees, Margaret said. The correspondence with me. It cost him something, but if the ranch sold for enough... It sold for considerably more than the land was worth, May said quietly. People talked about that too. He had a buyer from back east who didn't know Montana land prices. Paid nearly twice what it should have gone for. Margaret looked at the counter, at May's reading glasses lying there, at the ledger with its careful columns of numbers. He's done this before, she said. It wasn't new information, but saying it out loud with all the pieces in place felt different. More than once, maybe many times. And every time he does it, he sells something, property, a business, something with value. And he uses the woman as cover, as a reason to be in the area, as a story that makes sense to people. And then when it's done, May said, he's gone and she's left holding the embarrassment, which means she doesn't want to talk about it, which means no one compares notes. They looked at each other. Except, May said slowly, he sent a lawyer back this time. Because I didn't leave, Margaret said. He expected me to go home. That's what they all probably did. Went home, tried to forget it, didn't want the shame of explaining it. She straightened. I didn't go home. No, May said. You didn't. So now I'm a loose end he wants to tie off. If he can sue me, even if he loses eventually, it damages my reputation enough that anything I say about him gets dismissed. She said, he said, a jilted woman making claims. Her jaw tightened. It's clever. It is, May agreed, but it requires you to have no evidence, which he assumed I wouldn't. And do you? Margaret thought about the notebook, the columns she'd been building for 2 weeks, the letters in her trunk, the name in Wyoming that Silas had gotten from Billings. Not enough yet, she said, but I know where to look. She went back to the ranch with the particular focused energy of someone who has finally located the exact shape of the problem they're dealing with. It was almost a relief. The amorphous dread of not knowing was worse than the sharp specific fact of knowing, even when the fact was bad. Silas was in the yard when Pete pulled the wagon in, and he read her face the way Pete had read it earlier. Tell me, he said. She told him. All of it. What she'd worked out at May's, the theory about how Crowley operated, the pattern of it. Silas listened without interrupting, which she'd noticed was a habit of his. He waited until a person was completely finished before he spoke, which was rarer than it should be. When she was done, he said, the man in Billings, his name is Garrett Walsh. He's a trader, travels between territories, knows people everywhere. I can write to him today. Ask him to find out the name of the woman in Wyoming. Ask him if there are others. Yes, Margaret said. Do that. And I want to ride to Clearwater, he said. See Judge Reeves. Not to file anything yet, just to understand the landscape, know what we're working with. She looked at him. That's a day's ride. I know it. You'd do that. He looked back at her with an expression that was slightly impatient, the look of a man who doesn't understand why what he's offering is being questioned. You're working on my property. Crowley's lawsuit, if he files it, affects my household. That makes it my business. She understood that he meant it as a practical statement. She accepted it as one. All right, she said. He left for Clearwater the following morning before light. She watched the lamp in his room go out from her window and heard him moving in the pre-dawn quiet, and then heard the horse. Then nothing. She went back to her notebook. She'd organized Nathan's letters by date and cross-referenced everything he'd claimed about himself against what she now knew to be true. The discrepancies were significant. He'd claimed to have lived in Iron Creek for 8 years. The deed records May had helped her locate showed he'd purchased the property only 4 years ago. He'd claimed to have built the ranch house himself, but Pete, who'd been in the area long before Crowley arrived, said the house had already been standing when Crowley bought the land. He'd claimed to have no family living, no other connections. He'd claimed to be a straightforward man. The straightforward man had needed a lawyer from Helena. People don't hire Helena lawyers for small, straightforward matters. She wrote it all down. In the afternoon, Eli found her at the table with her papers spread out and sat down across from her with the serious expression he wore when he'd decided something was important. "Are you in trouble?" he asked. She looked up. "What makes you ask that?" "You've been writing a lot," he said. "You write when you're thinking hard, and you look like Papa looks when there's a problem with the cattle." She set her pen down. "I have a situation I'm working through," she said. "It's not a danger. It's more like a puzzle." He considered this. "What kind of puzzle?" "The kind where someone did something wrong and is trying to make it look like they didn't." Eli's forehead creased. "That's lying." "It is." "Papa says lying makes everything worse eventually," Eli said. "Your papa is right about that," Margaret said. Eli seemed satisfied. He got up and went back outside, and she heard Chester bark twice and then go quiet, the ordinary afternoon sounds of a working ranch, and she put her pen back to the paper. 3 days later, Silas came back from Clearwater. He came in at supper time, trail-dusty and tired, and ate without talking much, and she didn't push. After Eli was in bed, he came back to the kitchen and sat down and said, "Judge Reeves is a fair man. You were right about that." "What did he say?" "I didn't tell him specifics. Just outlined the general shape of a situation. A woman, letters, a man who left, a lawsuit being threatened." Silas turned his coffee cup. He said that in his experience, a man who sues for breach of a marriage agreement he himself violated is hoping the case never sees a courtroom. He's hoping the other party settles or disappears. "Because if it gets to a courtroom," Margaret said, "everything gets entered into the record." "Everything," Silas confirmed, "including his own conduct leading up to the supposed breach." She nodded slowly. "He doesn't want a trial. He wants the threat of one." "That's Reeves's read." "Then I need to make sure he knows I'm not afraid of a trial," she said. "Because I'm not." Silas looked at her steadily. "You sure about that? Once it's in a courtroom, it's public. Everything comes out. People will know why you came here. Some of them already do, but a courtroom makes it official." "I know," she said, "and you're still not afraid." "I'm frightened," she said precisely. "Frightened is different from afraid. Frightened means I know exactly what's at stake. Afraid would mean I'm not going to walk toward it anyway." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. The letter from Garrett Walsh arrived 9 days later, forwarded through May Delaney, who brought it out to the ranch herself, which told Margaret that May had read enough of the outside to understand it was urgent. Margaret opened it at the kitchen table with Silas standing across from her. Walsh had found 2 women, not one. 2. The first was a woman named Dorothy Price from Cheyenne, Wyoming, 34 years old, a widow with a small amount of savings. She'd corresponded with a man calling himself William Hargrove, a cattle rancher, recently widowed, looking for a companion, for 3 months. She'd traveled to a settlement called Blue Rock to meet him. He'd been gone 2 days before she arrived. He'd sold a property there 6 days before her arrival. The second was a woman named Ruth Elaine Sutter from Kansas City, 28 years old, a seamstress. She'd corresponded with a man calling himself James Whitfield, traveled to a mining settlement in the Dakota Territory, arrived to find him gone. He'd sold a business interest there, a share in a supply company, the week before. Margaret set the letter down. 3 names, she said. Crowley, Hargrove, Whitfield. Same man, Silas said. He wasn't asking. Same pattern, same timing, different name each time, different state, different type of property. She pressed her fingers to the letter. Walsh says Dorothy Price tried to file a complaint with a sheriff in Wyoming. She was told it was a civil matter, not criminal. She had no money to pursue it. She went home. And Ruth Sutter? Walsh doesn't know. He's still trying to locate her. Silas pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He looked at the letter and then at her. Margaret, you need to write to these women. I know. If they'll testify, I know. She was already reaching for paper. I need to write to Dorothy Price first. She tried to do something about it. That means she might still want to. She wrote the letter to Dorothy Price that night. It was the hardest letter she'd written since she got here. Harder than the one to Thomas, because she was writing to a stranger about a wound they shared, and there was no way to do that without reopening her own. She wrote plainly and without self-pity because she suspected Dorothy Price would respond better to plainness than to anything that sounded like an appeal for sympathy. She told her what had happened in Iron Creek. She told her about Coleman's visit. She told her what she was building and what she needed. "I understand if you don't want to revisit this," she wrote. "I understand if you've spent the past 2 years trying to put it behind you, and the last thing you need is a letter from Montana pulling it back up. But I believe he will keep doing this. I believe there are women we haven't found yet, and I believe that if we have the chance to stop it, we should try." She sealed it. She set it with the other letters to go to town. Then she sat back and thought about Nathan Crowley reading his lawyer's report about her. She's still in Iron Creek, she's employed, she seems to be gathering information, and what his face might look like when he understood she wasn't the easy mark he'd planned for. She hoped it was uncomfortable. She was still at the table at midnight when she heard a sound from outside. Not loud. A horse moving slowly. She went to the window. A rider on the road. Moving past the ranch entrance slowly, not stopping, but moving slowly enough that it wasn't someone just passing through. She watched until the rider was out of sight. Then she went and knocked on Silas's door. He answered quickly. She had the sense he hadn't been asleep. "There was a rider," she said, "on the road, moving slow, just looking." Silas said nothing for a moment. Then, "I'll tell Pete to keep watch tonight." "Has that happened before? Someone looking at the property?" "No," he said. "Not like that." She nodded and went back to her room. She lay down on the bed with her clothes still on, staring at the ceiling. Crowley was watching the situation. He was patient enough to watch before he moved. She'd known he was patient. 4 months of letters proved that. The careful, slow construction of something designed to look exactly like trust. The question was what he was planning. The lawsuit was a feint. She was increasingly sure of that. It was meant to destabilize her, get her off the ranch, get her somewhere without support and without the small network she'd been quietly building. She needed to move faster than he expected her to. In the morning, she told Silas everything she was thinking. He listened, standing at the kitchen counter with his coffee, and when she finished, he said, "What do you need from me?" "2 things," she said. "I need you to ride to Clearwater again and file a formal response to Coleman's lawsuit. Not just a statement that I intend to contest it, but a full response that includes the names Hargrove and Whitfield and a summary of the Wyoming situation. I want it on record before he makes his next move. And the second thing? I need you to ask Judge Reeves if he knows of any way to compel a man to appear in a jurisdiction where he doesn't currently reside, if that man has outstanding civil complaints from multiple states." Silas looked at her. "You want to pull him into a courtroom?" "I want him to have no choice but to walk into one," she said. "He sent Coleman to make me disappear. I want to send a message back that says, 'Come yourself.'" Silas was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face. Something that wasn't quite admiration but was in that direction, mixed with something more complicated that she didn't look at too directly. "All right," he said. "There's risk in it," she said. "If Dorothy Price doesn't write back, if Walsh can't find Ruth Sutter, if Thomas doesn't have anything useful from his contacts." "I know the risk," Silas said. "I'm still asking what you need." She looked at him across the kitchen. The morning light was coming through the window over the sink. Eli was still asleep. The ranch was quiet in the particular way it was quiet in the hour before it woke up and became itself. "I need a witness," she said. "Someone who saw Crowley's behavior in the weeks before he left. Someone who can speak to his state of mind, his plans, the fact that he was not in any way acting like a man who expected a woman to arrive." Silas nodded slowly. Pete was in town most days that month. He was at the feed store, Harker's place, when Crowley came in to talk about the sale. I remember Pete mentioning it. Would Pete testify to that? Silas looked at her steadily. "I'll ask him." He found Pete that afternoon. Margaret was in the kitchen garden, the one she and Eli had rescued, which was now producing with the slightly defiant enthusiasm of something that had nearly been given up on, when she heard them talking near the barn. She couldn't make out the words. She kept her hands in the dirt and let the conversation happen without her. Pete came to find her an hour later. He stood at the edge of the garden with his hat in his hands, turning it in the way she'd seen Silas do, and she thought again about Nathan Crowley's letter. "I'll be holding my hat in both hands because I expect I'll be nervous." She pushed the thought away. "I'll testify," Pete said. "Crowley was in Harker's store the day the sale closed. He was not acting like a man expecting company. He was acting like a man who was finished with a place and had his next destination already decided." "What did he say specifically?" Margaret asked. Pete thought back. He was talking to a freighter about trail conditions heading south, road conditions which passes were clear. He asked about travel time to the Utah territory. He looked at Margaret. "This was 3 weeks before you arrived." She nodded. The detail was real, and it was specific, and specific details were what made testimony believable. "Thank you, Pete," she said. "You're going to bring him to account," Pete said. "Not a question." "I intend to try." Pete looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "The last housekeeper quit because she found the place lonely and hard, said there wasn't enough warmth in it." He glanced at the kitchen garden, at the house with its repaired porch railing. "Doesn't look like the same place now." He put his hat back on and walked away before she could respond. She stood in the garden for a moment after he was gone. The fear was still there. It hadn't gone away. It was just staying in its appropriate place, manageable, below the line of function. She was frightened of what Crowley might do with a week or two more to plan. She was frightened that Dorothy Price wouldn't write back. She was frightened that she was overestimating her position and that Coleman would show up with something she hadn't anticipated. But under the fear was something else, something that had been building since the moment she'd sat on that bench with $14 and decided she wasn't going home. The writer had come past the property to look at her situation. What he'd seen was a woman with a notebook full of his names, a rancher who'd ridden 30 miles to talk to a judge, a hotel owner who knew every piece of information that had moved through this town in the past decade, a ranch hand willing to put his memory on record, and a woman in Wyoming who had already tried once to fight back and might, if asked plainly and with respect, want to try again. What Nathan Crowley had built across 3 territories in 4 years, the careful architecture of disappearance and reinvention, was being mapped by a schoolteacher from Vermont who had nothing left to lose and had found, to her own surprise, that being without things to lose was not the same as being without power. The letter from Thomas arrived 12 days after she'd sent hers. She read it in her room by lamplight. Thomas had contacts. Thomas had, in the course of his Boston legal work, connections to a network of lawyers across the East and Midwest who circulated information about civil fraud cases, the kind of low-level, hard-to-prosecute cases that fell through the gaps between jurisdictions. He'd made inquiries. Nathan Crowley's real name, according to Thomas's contact in Cincinnati, was Nathan Alderman Crowley. He had a record of civil complaints going back 7 years. Ohio, Indiana, Missouri, Wyoming. Different names in different states, the same structure every time. Property, letters, a woman, a disappearance. At least 5 incidents that Thomas's contact knew of, possibly more. And at the bottom of the letter, in Thomas's precise handwriting, Maggie. I said, "Are you sure about this? I didn't say you were wrong. Tell me what you need." She put the letter down. She sat there for a long time. 5 incidents, 5 women across 7 years. And he'd been bold enough, or reckless enough, or simply so confident in the disposability of the people he targeted, to send a lawyer back for the one who hadn't left. She thought about the rider on the road. She thought about Coleman's professional smile. She thought about Nathan Crowley somewhere south of here, in Utah maybe, or already somewhere else, waiting to hear that the loose end in Iron Creek had been efficiently handled. She picked up her pen. She began to write a letter to Dorothy Price that was different from the first one. Not an explanation this time. A strategy. Point by point, careful and clear, the same way she'd once written lesson plans for 30 children who needed to understand something complicated. What they were building, if Dorothy Price agreed, was not a complaint. It was a case. And Margaret Rowan, who had once stood on a train platform with $14 and chosen not to go home, was going to walk into a courtroom with it and make Nathan Crowley stand still long enough for the truth to catch him. Outside, the Montana night was quiet. Inside, the lamp burned steady, and she wrote. Part 4, Judgment Day. Dorothy Price's letter arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Margaret had sent the second one. It was not a long letter. Dorothy Price was not, Margaret gathered, a woman who used more words than necessary. 4 paragraphs, small handwriting, the kind of penmanship that comes from someone who learned to write in a time when paper was not cheap and space was not wasted. The first paragraph said she remembered everything, that she had spent 2 years trying not to, and that the letter from Montana had undone approximately 18 months of that effort in about 10 minutes. The second paragraph said she still had his letters, all of them, signed William Hargrove, but the handwriting, she'd looked again after Margaret's first letter arrived, was distinctive. A particular way of forming the letter G, a slight leftward lean on the capitals. She'd compared it to the sample Margaret had sent in her second letter. It was the same hand. The third paragraph said she would come to Clearwater if it came to a trial, that she had a sister in Billings who could take her in, and that the stage fare was something she could manage if she sold a piece of furniture she'd been meaning to sell anyway. The fourth paragraph was 3 sentences. I want you to know that I went home and I didn't tell anyone. Not because I wasn't angry, because I was ashamed, and that is the thing I am most angry about now. Margaret read that paragraph twice. Then she folded the letter and put it with the others, the growing file of them, organized in the tin box she'd bought at Harker's store, and sat for a moment with the specific feeling of a weight shifting. Dorothy Price had been ashamed, as if she'd done something wrong by trusting a man who lied to her with careful deliberation over a period of months. Margaret understood it. She'd felt the edges of it herself on that platform, in the first terrible days. That particular corrosive doubt, what was it in me that he saw? What made him think I was the kind of woman who could be handled this way? She'd decided early that she was not going to carry that. It had taken effort. Some days it still took effort, but the shame belonged to Nathan Crowley, and she was going to make sure he carried it himself. She went to find Silas. He was in the barn, working on a piece of harness with the focused attention he brought to anything with his hands. He looked up when she came in. She held up the letter. Dorothy Price will testify. Something shifted in his face. Relief, she thought. He'd been carrying the weight of this alongside her without making a show of it, and relief was the right word for what happened to his expression now. Good, he said. Thomas also wrote again. He has a contact at a law firm in Cincinnati who is willing to provide a sworn affidavit regarding Crowley's history of civil complaints in Ohio and Indiana, dates, names, amounts. She leaned against the barn door frame. We have the letters with the handwriting match. We have Pete's testimony about Crowley's behavior before I arrived. We have May's account of the property sale timeline. We have Dorothy. And now we have Ohio and Indiana. Silas set down the harness. When does Coleman need your formal response? He filed 10 days ago. I have until the end of this month. She paused. I want to file a counter-complaint. He looked at her. Against Crowley. For fraudulent misrepresentation. For the money I spent on travel and preparation based on false claims he made. It's a smaller number than what he made on the ranch sale, but it establishes that I'm not a defendant. I'm a victim of a scheme. That changes the entire shape of the case. Silas was quiet for a moment. He had the look of someone working through the logic of it. It forces him to respond to you instead of just attacking. Yes, she said, and responding means appearing, which means being in a courtroom where his history can be entered into evidence. She met his eyes. Coleman told him she'd run. She hasn't run. She's filed back. That's going to unsettle him. It might make him dangerous, Silas said carefully. He's already dangerous, Margaret said. The writer on the road, the lawyer, the lawsuit. He's been dangerous since before I arrived in this territory. She straightened. I'd rather face him in a courtroom than spend the next year looking over my shoulder. Silas picked up his hat from the post beside him and turned it once. Then he put it on. I'll ride to Clearwater tomorrow. Talk to Reeves. Help you get the counter-complaint drafted. You don't have to keep doing this, she said. Riding to Clearwater, taking days away from the ranch. He looked at her with that slightly impatient expression again. Margaret, I know I don't have to. She held his gaze. All right, she said. She told May that evening when she drove in to send letters. May listened to the whole plan standing behind her counter with her arms crossed, and her expression doing the particular thing it did when she was processing information rapidly and deciding where she stood on it. You're going to walk into that courtroom as a counter-plaintiff, May said. Yes. While Loretta Marsh and half the town is still convinced you're a desperate woman who got stranded here and latched onto the first available situation. Yes. May uncrossed her arms. Then you better win. I know. I'm not saying that to discourage you, May said. I'm saying it because if you walk in there and you win, those same people will remember that they live in the same town as the woman who did it. That means something, in a place this size. Margaret looked at her. Will you testify? About the property sale timing? About what you observed of Crowley's behavior? May's eyebrows went up. You're asking me? You run the hotel. Everyone in this town passes through your door eventually. What you know about the timeline of events here is more comprehensive than almost anyone else's. May was quiet for a moment. He stayed here, she said, at the hotel, for 6 weeks before he left. I have his registration dates. I have his bill. She reached under the counter and produced a ledger. She turned to a page about a third of the way through and turned it to face Margaret. Nathan Crowley arrived from, he said Bozeman, registered on the 14th of February, checked out on the 14th of April. She tapped the page. He was gone 8 days before you arrived, Margaret. 8 days, not 6 like the station master said. Margaret looked at the dates. He left on the 14th of April. He did. The ranch sale closed on the 12th, according to the deed records. 2 days, May said. He stayed 2 days after the sale closed, tying up whatever he needed to tie up. Margaret put her finger on the date. May I have a copy of this page? I'll make one myself, May said, and meant it by the way she was already reaching for paper. The formal counter-complaint was filed 12 days later. Silas had ridden to Clearwater twice in that time, and Judge Reeves had been, according to Silas's account, impressed enough by the documentation that he'd agreed to consolidate Coleman's original lawsuit and Margaret's counter-complaint into a single hearing. One courtroom, both matters addressed together. Reeves had also, through channels Margaret didn't ask too many questions about, sent a notice to Nathan Crowley's attorney of record indicating that failure to appear in the proceeding would result in a default judgment against his client on the counter-complaint. Crowley would have to show up or lose automatically. When Silas told her that last part, she sat with it for a long moment. He'll come, she said. He'll come, Silas agreed. He's going to be angry. Probably. Good, she said, and went back to her notebook. The day before the hearing, Dorothy Price arrived in Clearwater on the stage from Billings. Margaret had arranged to stay overnight at a boarding house in Clearwater. May had recommended it, a woman named Hendricks who ran a clean and quiet operation, and she met Dorothy in the front room that evening. Dorothy Price was a tall woman, lean, somewhere in her mid-30s, with the kind of face that had been through something and hadn't quite recovered its previous arrangement. She shook Margaret's hand with a firm, dry grip and sat down across from her and said, "Let me see your letters." Margaret showed her. Dorothy went through them methodically, comparing handwriting against her own copies, which she produced from a leather case she'd been carrying against her side the entire trip. She didn't speak while she did it. Margaret waited. "Same hand," Dorothy finally said. She didn't look surprised. "Same word choices, too. He wrote to me about being a man who preferred honesty. Said it nearly the same way he said it to you." "He has a script," Margaret said. "Adjusted for details. Different name, different property, different state. But the core of it is the same." Dorothy set the letters down. She looked at her hands for a moment. "I want you to understand something," she said. "I'm here because you asked me plainly and didn't pretend it was going to be easy. I appreciate that. But I want to be clear. This isn't something I've talked about. My sister here knows some of it. That's it. Walking into a courtroom tomorrow is, I need you to know what that costs me." "I know what it costs you," Margaret said. I wouldn't have asked if I thought there was another way." Dorothy looked at her. "Is there going to be a point," she said, "where his lawyer tries to make us look like hysterical women who are inventing things?" "Yes," Margaret said. "Probably Coleman will try something in that direction, but we have the handwriting comparison. We have the Ohio and Indiana affidavits. We have dates and records and May Delaney's hotel ledger." She paused. "I won't tell you it's going to be clean, but I think the evidence is strong enough that trying to dismiss us as hysterical would just make him look worse. Dorothy nodded slowly. All right. She picked up her letters and put them back in the case. I'll be there. The courtroom in Clearwater was a single large room in the back of the county building, with 6 rows of benches and a judge's bench that was higher than the rest of the furniture, as if Reeves had made a deliberate architectural decision about the importance of elevation. It smelled of sawdust and old paper. Margaret arrived early. She sat at the respondent's table and she was still technically the respondent to Coleman's original lawsuit, a fact that still irritated her, and organized her documents in the order she intended to present them. Thomas had sent, in his final letter, a summary memo that laid out every piece of evidence in chronological order with a note on each item's evidentiary value. She'd read it 6 times. Silas sat behind her in the first row of benches. He'd dressed in his good coat, which she'd noticed hanging on the back of his door for the past week being carefully avoided until today. Pete sat beside him. May had ridden in from Iron Creek at dawn. Dorothy Price was 3 seats down the bench, straight-backed, her leather case on her lap. Calhoun, the youngest of the ranch hands, had apparently decided on his own to come, and was in the second row with Dutch, both of them sitting with the particular careful posture of men who are somewhere they've never been before and want to behave correctly. Margaret looked at all of them and then looked away before the thing in her chest became something she had to manage visibly. Nathan Crowley arrived 15 minutes before the hour. She heard him before she saw him. Voices in the hall, Coleman's careful professional tone, and another voice, lower, with the same deliberate ease she remembered from his letters. The constructed quality of a man who has decided who he's going to be in any given room and settled into it before he walks through the door. He came in and she made herself look. He was exactly what she'd expected and nothing like what she'd imagined. Medium height, well-dressed in the specific way of a man who understands that appearance is a tool. Dark hair, beginning to gray at the temples. A face that would read as trustworthy in a letter, and was still doing that work in person. Open, measured, with just enough something in the eyes to suggest depth without revealing what kind. He looked at her, and she watched the moment he recognized that this was not the situation he'd expected to walk into. His eyes moved to Dorothy Price. Something went through his face, controlled, professional, gone in a second, but she'd been watching for it and she saw it. He sat at the plaintiff's table with Coleman and opened a case of his own papers. He didn't look at her again. Reeves came in and the room stood and then sat, and the judge settled behind his bench with the unhurried manner of a man who has been doing this long enough that the performance aspect of it no longer interests him. He was in his 60s, with white hair cut short, and the kind of eyes that had heard a great many versions of a great many stories and had developed a particular tolerance for none of them. We have 2 matters before this court today, Reeves said without preamble. A civil action filed by Nathan Crowley against Margaret Rowan, alleging breach of a marriage agreement, and a counter-complaint filed by Margaret Rowan against Nathan Crowley, alleging fraudulent misrepresentation resulting in material loss. He looked at both tables. Mr. Coleman, since your client's action was filed first, you may proceed. Coleman stood. He was smooth, Margaret would give him that. The kind of smooth that comes from practice, from having stood in rooms like this one many times and understood how to fill them. He outlined Crowley's position with precision. An agreement entered into by correspondence, the plaintiff's financial and personal investment in the arrangement, the defendant's failure to appear as agreed, the resulting breach. He did not mention that Crowley had left town 8 days before Margaret arrived. He did not mention Wyoming. He did not mention Ohio or Indiana. He spoke for 20 minutes, and what he built was a story about an impulsive woman who had come west on a hasty decision and was now looking for someone to blame for the consequences. Margaret sat very still through all of it. She had one hand flat on the table. She kept her face neutral the way she kept her face neutral in a classroom when a student was saying something incorrect and she was letting them finish before she addressed it. When Coleman sat down, Reeves looked at her. Miss Rowan, you may respond. She stood. She'd thought about this for 3 weeks. How to begin? She'd written several openings and discarded all of them because they started with her feelings, her experience, her losses. That was the wrong beginning. The wrong beginning would let Coleman frame it as exactly what he'd implied. A woman's grievance. She started with the date. Your Honor, on April 14th of this year, Nathan Crowley checked out of the Delaney Hotel in Iron Creek, Montana Territory, where he had been residing for 6 weeks. She opened May's hotel ledger copy and laid it on the table so Reeves could see it. That is a fact in the record of that establishment, and Mrs. May Delaney, present in this courtroom today, is prepared to attest to it. She paused. Let the date sit. My train arrived in Iron Creek on April 22nd, 8 days later. She looked at Crowley for the first time since he'd walked in. He was watching her with the professional calm of a man who has not yet understood how much trouble he is in. Mr. Crowley's lawsuit claims that I breached our agreement by failing to fulfill its terms. I would ask this court to consider carefully what terms can be fulfilled by a woman arriving at a station where the man who invited her has been absent for 8 days. Reeves was looking at the hotel ledger copy. Continue, he said. She went through it methodically. Not emotionally. She'd made a deliberate decision about that. Emotion was what Coleman was expecting, what he was prepared to reframe as unreliability. She gave him facts instead. The deed records on the ranch sale, closing April 12th. The station master's account, submitted in a written statement she'd had him sign. Pete's testimony about Crowley's behavior and his inquiry about Utah travel routes 3 weeks before her arrival. Coleman objected twice. Both times Reeves looked at the documentation she presented in support of the statement and overruled. Then she said, Your Honor, I would like to call Dorothy Price. Coleman was on his feet immediately. Objection. This witness has no standing in the matter before this court, whatever her relationship to the plaintiff. The witness has direct relevance to the countercomplaint, Margaret said, which is being heard in the same proceeding. Her testimony speaks to a pattern of conduct that establishes the nature of Mr. Crowley's representations and the deliberateness of his actions. Reeves looked at Coleman. The matters are consolidated. I'll hear the witness. He looked at Margaret. Proceed. Dorothy Price walked to the front of the room with the bearing of someone who has decided to do a hard thing and is not going to let the difficulty show until afterward. She sat down. Margaret asked her questions the way she'd planned them, not leading, clean and direct, the way Thomas had taught her from his letters. Let the witness tell the story, you just open the door. Dorothy told it plainly. The letters, the promises, the journey from Cheyenne, the empty settlement, the property that had sold the week before she arrived. She described the man who had written to her, and as she spoke, she looked at Crowley with the steady gaze of a woman who had been sitting on something for 2 years and had decided today was the last day she was going to hold it. The man who signed his letters as William Hargrove, Dorothy said, wrote to me that he was a man who preferred honesty above all things. He wrote that he had been building something real in Wyoming and wanted someone to build it with. She paused. I came to Wyoming to find an empty building and a man who had never been honest a day in his life. The room was very quiet. Coleman cross-examined her. He was careful about it. He was smart enough not to be aggressive, because being aggressive toward a woman who had clearly been wronged in a room full of people watching was a bad calculation. He tried to establish that she had no direct proof the man who wrote to her and Nathan Crowley were the same person. Margaret had expected this. She asked to present Exhibit 7, a side-by-side comparison of handwriting samples from Dorothy's letters and her own, prepared by a retired schoolteacher from Clearwater who had spent 30 years teaching penmanship and had agreed in a written statement that the formations were consistent with a single author. Coleman objected. Reeves looked at the comparison, looked at it for a while. Overruled, he said. Then she presented the affidavit from Cincinnati. Thomas's contact had organized it carefully. The civil complaints in Ohio and Indiana, dated, named, structured. 5 women, not counting Margaret, not counting Dorothy, going back 7 years. The room had been quiet before. Now it was a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes over people when they realize the thing they're looking at is larger than they thought. Coleman objected to the affidavit on grounds of hearsay and jurisdictional relevance. Reeves removed his glasses and set them on the bench in front of him and looked at Coleman with the expression of a man who has heard a great many objections and knows when one is being made for technical reasons and when it is being made because the objecting party has run out of better options. Mr. Coleman, Reeves said, The affidavit is from a licensed member of the Ohio Bar and speaks to civil court records, which are public documents. It is not hearsay, and its relevance to the question of pattern and intent is evident. He put his glasses back on. Overruled. Crowley said something to Coleman in a low voice. Margaret couldn't hear it, but she could read the edge in it. Coleman responded without turning his head, equally low. It was the first crack, small, barely visible, but she'd been watching. When it came time for Crowley to take the stand, Coleman put him up there with the confidence of a man making the best of a situation that had gotten harder than expected. Crowley settled into the witness chair with that same surface ease, the ease she'd once thought indicated character, and now recognized as practice. He told the story the way Coleman had told it. Misunderstanding, changed circumstances, a situation that had gotten out of hand. He said he had left Iron Creek due to unexpected financial pressures and that the timing had been unfortunate, and he had intended to make contact with Miss Rowan to explain the situation, but circumstances had prevented it. He used the word unfortunate 4 times in 6 minutes. Margaret stood up to cross-examine. She had 6 questions. She'd written them out the night before, tested each one, thought about what answer each one would produce and what the follow-up to each answer would be. She didn't have to improvise. She just had to ask them in order. Mr. Crowley, she said, on April 12th, the date the sale of your Iron Creek ranch closed, did you know at that point what date I was expected to arrive? Crowley looked at Coleman. Coleman's face said nothing useful. I was aware, Crowley said carefully, that a date had been discussed. Yes or no, Mr. Crowley, on April 12th, did you know I was arriving April 22nd? A pause. Yes. Did you make any attempt on April 12th, or in the subsequent 8 days before my arrival, to send word to me that you had sold your property and would not be present? Another pause. Longer. The situation was complicated at that point. I'll take that as a no, Margaret said. Did you make any attempt to contact the matchmaking agency in Vermont to inform them of the changed circumstances? He stopped. Not at that time. Did you make any attempt to contact the Delaney Hotel where you had been residing to leave a message for me upon my arrival? I believed, Mr. Crowley, yes or no? No, he said. Did you contact any person in Iron Creek to meet me and explain the situation on your behalf? No. She paused. Let those 4 consecutive no's sit in the room with everyone in it. So, she said, to confirm for this court, you were aware of my arrival date, you had sold your property and vacated the premises 8 days prior, and you made no attempt through any channel to reach me or anyone on my behalf before, during, or after my arrival. The circumstances— Thank you, Margaret said. No further questions. She sat down. The room was doing that thing rooms do when something conclusive has just happened and everyone knows it before anyone says so. She could feel it in the benches behind her. Not movement, just a kind of collective recalibration. Coleman made a closing argument that was competent and quiet and had none of the confidence of his opening. He used phrases like on balance and given the complexity and reasonable accommodation. These were the phrases of a man building an exit from a position rather than defending it. Margaret made her closing statement in 11 minutes. She summarized the timeline, the documentation, the pattern, and the human cost of what she'd been through. Then she said one last thing. This court has heard that Mr. Crowley's lawsuit was filed against a woman who, according to his own testimony, he abandoned without communication. It has heard that this is not the first time he has entered into such an arrangement and departed before the other party arrived. The question before this court is not whether I breached an agreement. I did not. The question is whether a man who made promises he never intended to keep, who executed a financial transaction timed to his departure, who made no attempt of any kind to communicate a change in plans, is entitled to use this court as a tool to silence the person he wronged. She looked at Reeves. With respect, Your Honor, the answer to that question ought to be no. She sat down. Reeves looked at the papers in front of him for a long time. No one in the room moved. Then he said, The court finds no evidence of breach of agreement on the part of the respondent, Margaret Rowan. The evidence presented establishes clearly that the plaintiff vacated the arrangement by his own unilateral action prior to the respondent's arrival. The plaintiff's complaint is dismissed. Coleman had his face arranged neutrally. Crowley's had gone very still. On the counter-complaint, Reeves continued, the court finds in favor of the complainant. The evidence of pattern, the corroborating witness testimony, and the documentary record from multiple jurisdictions support the allegation of fraudulent misrepresentation resulting in material loss. Mr. Crowley is ordered to pay restitution in the amount of the complainant's documented travel and preparation costs, plus court fees, within 30 days. He looked directly at Nathan Crowley over the edge of his glasses. I will also be forwarding a summary of today's proceedings and the evidence presented to the relevant authorities in Ohio and Indiana. Whether those jurisdictions choose to act is their determination, but the record will be available to them. Crowley said nothing. His face was the face of someone calculating rapidly, not the composed, trustworthy, open face he'd walked in with, but the face underneath it, the one that was working, assessing, deciding what the next move was. It was the first time she'd seen his real face. She looked at it for a moment and felt nothing in particular. Not triumph. That wasn't quite the right word for what she felt. Something more like resolution, like a piece of furniture finally set down after you've been carrying it a long distance. Coleman leaned over and said something quietly to Crowley. Crowley listened. Then he stood, buttoned his coat, and walked out of the courtroom without looking at Margaret or Dorothy or anyone else in the room. He walked out the way he'd left the depot, without looking back. But this time there was a record, a public record, in a court in Clearwater with his real name on it, with Ohio and Indiana holding the same information, with Dorothy Price in the room. He could walk away, but the thing he'd walked away from would stay. Margaret sat for a moment after the room began to move, people shifting, standing, murmuring to each other in the way of people who have witnessed something that will be discussed for a long time. She sat and breathed slowly and let the past few weeks settle into whatever permanent shape they were going to take. Silas sat down next to her, not across, next to, in the chair that had been empty beside her at the table. He didn't say anything right away. "You all right?" he said finally. "I think so," she said. "Ask me again in an hour." He nodded, made no move to go anywhere. Dorothy came and found her. Dorothy's face was complicated. Relief and grief tangled together in the specific way they tangle when something you've been holding for too long finally gets set down and you discover how heavy it actually was. "Thank you," Dorothy said, "for writing to me." "Thank you for coming," Margaret said. They didn't hug. They weren't that kind of women, either of them, with strangers. But Dorothy held out her hand and Margaret shook it, and the handshake held something that mattered. May found her next and said, with the characteristic economy she brought to every situation, "Good." Just that. But the way she said it meant considerably more. Pete, when she made it to where he was standing near the back bench with Dutch and Calhoun, looked at her with his permanent squint and said, "I've seen cattle drives that were less work." "I've never been on a cattle drive," Margaret said. "Same general principle," Pete said. "A lot of moving parts, everyone has opinions, and at the end you're tired and you hope it was worth it." "Was it?" she asked. He considered this seriously. "Yep," he said. She walked out of the county building into the afternoon light of Clearwater. The mountains were in the distance, same mountains she'd seen from the train platform when she'd first arrived in this territory. Big and indifferent and permanent, the way things are when they predate every human drama happening at their feet. She stood there for a moment. Somewhere south of here, Nathan Crowley was in a buggy with his lawyer, already calculating his next move in his next territory under his next name. Maybe she'd stopped him. Maybe she'd only slowed him down. Maybe Ruth Sutter, wherever she was, would eventually be found and her story added to the record. Maybe the Ohio and Indiana authorities would act. Maybe they wouldn't. She couldn't control any of that. What she could control was what she'd done. And what she'd done was stand in a courtroom with evidence she'd built from $14 and a tin box and the particular stubbornness she'd apparently had since before she could remember. And she'd made Nathan Crowley stand still long enough for the truth to arrive. It wasn't perfect. Nothing about it was perfect. But the record existed. His name was in it. And the women he'd targeted, 2 of them anyway, had looked at him across a room and not looked away. She heard the door behind her, and Silas came out. He stood beside her, not too close, and looked at the same mountains she was looking at. "We should head back before dark," he said. "I know," she said. Neither of them moved immediately. The light was that particular afternoon quality that makes everything slightly more itself than usual, sharper, warmer, the kind of light that the territory specialized in, and Vermont, for all its beauty, had never quite matched. "Eli's with Mrs. Hendricks until we get back," Silas said. "She has a cat. He's probably forgotten we exist." "He'll remember when he's hungry," Margaret said. Silas made the sound that lived one step behind a laugh. She was familiar with it now, after these weeks. She'd catalogued it without meaning to. "You did something today," he said, and his voice had lost its usual careful evenness. He sounded, for a moment, like what he was when he wasn't managing it. A man who had been worried about someone and had spent several hours discovering that the worry had been earned, but the outcome was all right. "We did something," she said. "May, Pete, Dorothy, Thomas, you." She glanced at him. "You rode to Clearwater twice." "I know how many times I rode to Clearwater." She looked at the mountains. "Why did you?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the avoiding the question quiet she'd encountered in the early weeks, just the quiet of a man choosing his words with some care because he'd decided the careless version wasn't what he wanted to say. "Because it was right," he said. Then, after a pause, "and because it mattered to me that things turned out well for you." She didn't answer right away. She let that sit between them in the afternoon light, with the mountains in the distance, and it sat there without either of them rushing to cover it with something else. "We should go get your son," she said finally. "Yeah," Silas said. They walked back to where the wagon was hitched, and the mountains stayed where they always were, and the light did what light does in the late afternoon in Montana, and the day that had started with a courtroom and ended with something neither of them had given a name to, yet moved toward its close in the way that days do, simply, without asking permission, carrying everything that had happened in it forward into whatever came next. Part 5. The home she never expected. The wagon ride back from Clearwater took 2 hours, and for most of it nobody talked much. Eli had fallen asleep against Margaret's side before they'd made it a mile out of town, his head heavy on her arm, one hand still loosely holding the sleeve of her coat the way he did when he slept. Like even unconscious, he wasn't entirely willing to let go. Mrs. Hendricks's cat had apparently made a significant impression because he'd talked about it nonstop for the first 20 minutes of the ride and then simply run out of energy and gone under, mid-sentence, the way children do when they've spent everything they have. Margaret sat with his weight against her and watched the road. Silas drove. He wasn't the kind of man who filled silence because silence made him nervous, and she'd come to appreciate that about him in the weeks she'd been on the ranch. The quiet between them had changed its texture since the early days. It wasn't the careful quiet of two people being polite around their own uncertainties anymore. It was the quieter quiet of people who had been through something together and didn't need to narrate it. The mountains went pink in the west as the sun dropped behind them. The road home was the same road it had always been, rutted, dry, running between scrub and open land. But something about it felt different in the early evening after the day they'd had. Less provisional, maybe. More like a road that went somewhere she actually intended to be. She thought about that word. Home. She turned it over quietly, the way you turn something over when you're not sure yet if you trust it. She'd had a home in Millhaven, a room above the schoolhouse with good light in the morning and a neighbor woman named Clara who kept an eye on things, and a job she was genuinely good at, and a life that was decent and quiet, and had started to feel, after enough years, like a coat that fit correctly but was cut for someone slightly smaller than she'd eventually become. This wasn't that. This was harder than that. Harder in ways she hadn't predicted, and a few she had. The work was physical in a way school teaching wasn't. The social landscape of a small frontier town was different from a Vermont village in ways that were sometimes better and sometimes significantly worse. She was still, even now, even after the courtroom, conscious of being an outsider in certain rooms. The woman from Vermont, the mail-order bride who got stranded. That story would always precede her here, would always be the first thing some people reached for when they needed a category to put her in. But it was also, and she sat with this honestly, because she tried to be honest with herself even about the inconvenient things. It was also the most fully herself she had felt in years, maybe ever. She had not known, until she had to fight for something in a new place with no history and no support network and $14, what she was actually made of. She knew now. She wasn't entirely sure she liked all of it. She'd discovered she could be cold when she needed to be, calculated in ways that surprised her, capable of a steady anger that had no interest in burning itself out. But she knew it was hers. Eli made a small sound in his sleep and pressed closer. She adjusted her arm. Silas glanced over. "You do that a lot?" she asked quietly, meaning the instant trusting sleep. "Used to," Silas said. "Not so much after Claire died. He went light for a while, like he wasn't sure the ground was going to hold." He looked back at the road. "He's been sleeping heavier lately." She didn't say anything to that. What was there to say that wouldn't be either too much or too little? When they got back to the ranch, Pete came out to take the horse without being asked, because Pete had an instinct for when people needed something handled without having to ask for it. He took one look at the sleeping boy and the two of them in the wagon and said nothing, which was also an instinct he had. Silas carried Eli inside. Margaret followed, lit the lamp in the kitchen, put the kettle on because she needed something to do with her hands. She heard Silas in Eli's room, the low sounds of a child being settled half awake into bed, the murmur of a father saying something she couldn't make out, and then the quiet. She made 2 cups of tea and sat down at the kitchen table. Silas came back and sat across from her and looked at the tea like it had appeared there without explanation, which maybe from his perspective it had. He picked it up anyway. "Thomas will want to know how it went," she said. "Write him tomorrow. I need to write Dorothy, too. Make sure she got back to her sister all right." "Tomorrow," Silas said, not dismissive, just tonight is for tonight. Let tomorrow be for tomorrow. She looked at her tea. "Do you think it stops him?" She didn't have to explain who him was. Silas considered it. "I think it complicates his next move. Judge Reeves forwarding the record to Ohio and Indiana. That's real. His name being attached to a public ruling in this territory. That's real. Whether it stops him depends on how much he's willing to risk, and I don't know the man well enough to answer that." "I don't either," she said. "And I thought I did." She paused. "Or I thought I knew something about him, which is not the same as knowing him, but it felt the same from inside." Silas turned his cup in his hands. "That's not stupidity," he said. "That's just what a person does when someone spends 4 months presenting themselves carefully." "I keep thinking about the other women," she said. "Ruth Sutter, wherever she is. The ones in Ohio and Indiana who are named in that affidavit. Women who probably went home and told themselves it was their fault for being naive and then spent years carrying that. Some of them might get something out of today," Silas said, "if the record goes to the right people." "Maybe." She looked at the window. Outside, the ranch was the ranch, but dark, settled, the sounds of animals and wind and the particular quiet of land that has nothing to prove. I think about what he counted on. The shame, the silence. He built the whole thing on the assumption that the people he hurt would be too ashamed to say anything, and he was right, almost every time. She pressed her fingers flat on the table. "That's the part that stays with me. Not what he did to me specifically. What he understood about how people work, about women specifically, and how precisely he used it." Silas was quiet for a moment. "And the part that stops working," he said, "is when one of them decides she's not going to be ashamed." She looked at him. "You walked off that platform," he said, "and you didn't go home. You didn't hide it. You asked May about work in public in a hotel lobby the same day. You told me who you were and what happened to you the same afternoon you met me, and you did it straight, without making it small to make it easier to hear." He shook his head slightly. "The whole structure he built relies on the woman going quiet. You went the opposite direction." She thought about what that had cost her, the looks in the general store, Loretta Marsh. The whispers she'd heard and the ones she'd only suspected. The feeling of walking into a room and knowing the room had a story about her that it had decided before she opened her mouth. "It wasn't courage," she said honestly. "At first it was just, I didn't have anywhere else to go. And then it was anger, and then eventually it became a choice." She looked at him. But in the beginning, it was mostly just having no other option. Most courage starts that way, Silas said. She almost said something to that. Then she didn't. They sat for a while with the tea and the lamp and the ordinary sounds of the house settling into the night, and at some point it stopped being the end of the day they'd had and became just an evening. Just two people sitting in a kitchen that had been a cold and disorganized room 4 weeks ago and was now something else. She went to bed eventually and slept better than she'd slept in weeks. In the morning, Iron Creek knew. She wasn't sure how. May probably, or Pete talking to someone in town, or simply the speed at which information moved in a place small enough that everyone's business was eventually adjacent to everyone else's. By the time she drove in for supplies 3 days after the hearing, it was clear that the story had gotten there before her. Parker met her at the counter with a different expression than she'd seen from him before. More direct, less carefully neutral. "Heard the hearing went well," he said. "It did," she said. He nodded. Then, with the particular economy of a man who had decided to spend more words than usual, "What you did took guts. I want you to know I think so." She thanked him. She meant it. The change was not dramatic. Small towns don't turn on a dime, and she knew better than to expect them to. But the quality of the looks changed. The careful politeness that had contained a certain condescension, the bless her heart undertone she'd felt in certain interactions since she arrived, lost most of its edge. People who had been avoiding direct engagement now made it. A woman she didn't know stopped her on the street and said simply, "Good for you," and kept walking. It wasn't a transformation. It was a recalibration, and she accepted it for what it was. Loretta Marsh she encountered near the end of the week at the general store. Margaret saw her first and made the deliberate decision not to change her path or speed. Loretta saw her, and for a moment the air between them did the thing air does when two people are figuring out what version of an encounter they're going to have. Loretta said, "I may have been unkind to you earlier." Margaret looked at her. "You were," she said, "but I've had worse recently, and I understand how things looked from outside." It was not a full forgiveness, and it wasn't meant to be. But it was an accurate statement, and accurate was what she had to offer. Loretta seemed to understand this and take it as what it was. They went their separate ways. It was May who told her, 2 weeks after the hearing, about Ruth Sutter. Garrett Walsh had finally located her. Ruth Sutter was in Kansas City, working as a seamstress, had been for the 2 years since she'd come back from the Dakota Territory with a story she'd told no one. Walsh had told her about the Clearwater hearing, about the public record, about Margaret and Dorothy, and the Ohio and Indiana affidavit. According to Walsh, Ruth Sutter had read his letter 3 times and then sat down and written a statement of her own, a detailed account of her correspondence with the man calling himself James Whitfield, the journey to Dakota, the empty building, the property that had sold the week before. She'd sent the statement to the territorial court in Clearwater, to the Ohio authorities Thomas's contact had flagged, and to a newspaper in Kansas City. The newspaper had published it. Margaret read the summary Walsh had sent May and sat with it for a long moment. 3 women whose accounts were now in public record. Ohio and Indiana authorities with the full case history. A newspaper story that would move through the territory press the way stories moved. Slowly but reliably, the way water moves through rock. Nathan Crowley's real name attached to all of it. He could run. He probably would. But the thing he'd been doing for 7 years, the precise, patient erasure of each incident before moving to the next, was now substantially harder. Because the incidents were connected. Because 3 women had stopped being ashamed on the same page of the same public document. She thought about Ruth Sutter in Kansas City, writing that statement. Alone, probably. At a table, with a lamp, the way Margaret had written her letters, deciding that the silence cost more than the exposure. She thought, I hope it helped her. I hope it helped more than it hurt. She didn't know. You never entirely knew with these things. But the record existed. What happened on the ranch in the weeks after the hearing was quieter than any of the preceding drama, which was perhaps why it mattered more. Quiet things often do. They get into the gaps between the big events and do their actual work there. Eli stopped calling her Miss Rowan sometime in early June. She hadn't noticed it happening exactly. It was the kind of shift that occurs in increments too small to catch. One afternoon she realized he'd been calling her Margaret for about a week without anyone having discussed it. She didn't say anything about it. He taught her, with solemn expertise, everything relevant about Chester, which was considerable. Chester had opinions about weather, could predict rain with his ears, was afraid of the rooster in the yard, and had once, Eli reported this with the gravity of someone recounting a historical event, chased a coyote entirely off the property at 2 a.m. Margaret listened to all of this as she would listen to any important briefing, seriously and with follow-up questions, which Eli found deeply satisfying. She taught him, in exchange, to read better than he had been. He was 6, nearly 7, and had the reading level of a child who had been taught in fits and starts by a father who was good at many things, but not at sitting still long enough to work through a primer. She found a copy of McGuffey's Reader in her trunk. She'd kept it from her teaching days, couldn't say exactly why, and they worked through it together most evenings, at the kitchen table, with Chester asleep under Eli's chair and the lamp between them. He was faster than she'd expected. He had a good mind, quick, with the sideways quality that meant he'd be the kind of student who found the connection between things that hadn't seemed connected. She recognized the type. She'd always liked that type. Silas watched sometimes from the doorway without coming in. She was aware of it and didn't make it a thing. One evening in late June, after Eli was in bed, Silas came into the kitchen, and instead of sitting across from her at the table, he stood near the window, which was unusual. He had his arms crossed, and the expression of someone who has been circling something for a while and has decided tonight is the night to stop circling. "I need to say something," he said. She set her pen down. "I know why you came here," he said. "I know the situation that brought you to Iron Creek, and I know it was not anything you'd have chosen if you'd had the full picture. And I know the arrangement we made when you arrived was an employment arrangement, a practical thing." "Silas," she said. "Let me finish," he said, not sharp. "Just, I've been working up to this, and I'd like to get there. I know you've built something here, in the kitchen, in the garden, with Eli. I know the ranch runs better than it has in 2 years, and I know that's because of you." He paused. "What I don't know is whether any of that means you want to stay, permanently, not as an employee." Another pause, shorter. "As something else." She looked at him. He was not a man who made speeches. He was not comfortable making this one. She could see that, the slight tension in his jaw, the arms crossed, not defensively, but the way you cross your arms when you're cold and there's no fire available. He'd said it anyway. She thought about what she wanted to say. She thought about doing it cleanly. "Last October," she said, "I read a letter from a man I'd never met, and I thought, this might be something real. I thought that because the letter sounded like a man who wanted the same things I wanted, something solid, something built, not perfect, just real." She looked at her hands on the table. "I was wrong about the man, but I don't think I was wrong about what I wanted." Silas uncrossed his arms. "The ranch is not what I planned," she said. "Eli is not who I planned. You are definitely not who I planned." She looked up at him. "But I stopped caring very much about the plan sometime around the second week, when I fixed your porch railing and Dutch looked at me like I'd done something surprising." She paused. "I'm not a person who needs to be surprised. I'm a person who needs to be useful and known and not managed." She met his eyes. "You've never tried to manage me. That counts for more than you might think." The kitchen was quiet. "So," Silas said, "you'd stay." "I'd stay," she said. He nodded. Then he said, "I should have said this better. I had something more organized in my head earlier, and it—" "Silas," she said, "what you said was fine. It was honest," she said. "That's what I needed it to be." He looked at her for a moment. Then he sat down, not across from her this time, but at the end of the table, closer than the arrangement they'd established in the early days. He put his forearms on the table and looked at the lamp between them. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They sat there for a while. It wasn't exactly a romantic scene. The kitchen was the kitchen, the lamp needed trimming, there was a list of ranch supplies she hadn't finished writing, and at some point Chester got up from wherever he'd been sleeping and wandered in and pushed his nose against Silas's knee and was ignored. But it was real. It was exactly as real as the lamp and the supply list and the dog, and that was, she had decided, what she'd been looking for all along. They married in September. It was not a large ceremony because neither of them wanted a large ceremony, and also because the population of Iron Creek was not going to provide one regardless of what they wanted. The town's reverend was out of the territory on a prolonged visit east, so they were married by Judge Harlan Reeves, who had ridden in from Clearwater for the occasion and seemed genuinely pleased to be participating in something that was not a lawsuit. May Delaney wore her best dress, which turned out to be dark blue with small buttons down the front, and stood at the front of the small crowd with the expression of someone who has seen a good outcome arrive at the end of a complicated situation and is allowing herself to feel satisfied about it. Pete wore a clean shirt that was visibly uncomfortable and stood straight throughout, and Dutch wore the same expression he'd worn while holding up the porch railing, mildly surprised by circumstances and quietly all right with them. Calhoun brought wildflowers that he presented to Margaret with the solemnity of a man who has been coached on this gesture and is determined to execute it correctly. Harker came. So did 3 women from town who had begun to stop Margaret in the street for regular conversation over the past months, and a ranching family from a property 8 miles north whose children Margaret had been teaching to read through an informal arrangement she'd started in late July. Thomas could not come. The distance was too far, the timing too tight. But he sent a letter that arrived 2 days before the ceremony, and she read it on the porch in the morning light and laughed at the 3rd paragraph and cried a little at the 4th and folded it up and kept it. Dorothy Price sent a short note and a pressed flower from Wyoming that Margaret put between the pages of one of her 7 books. Eli stood between Margaret and Silas during the ceremony and was very serious about it. He held Silas's hand on one side and Margaret's on the other and divided his attention between Reeves's words and Chester, who had been forbidden from the ceremony and was making his feelings about this known from a distance. When Reeves asked the essential questions and they answered, Eli, who was nearly 7 and took his responsibilities seriously, looked up at Margaret with his dark eyes and said very quietly, "Is it official now?" "Almost," she whispered. "And then you stay," he said. "Not a question." "And then I stay," she said. He nodded, satisfied, and looked back at Reeves with the air of a person who has confirmed the important detail and is now ready to proceed. When it was done, when Reeves said the words that made it done, Eli threw himself at Margaret with the force of a small person who has been holding back for the last 10 minutes out of ceremony-appropriate restraint and has now been released. She caught him the way she'd caught him in the street that first day in Iron Creek, with both arms and without flinching, and he put his face against her neck and said something she couldn't quite make out. "What did you say?" she asked. "I said I knew," he said. "When I saw you, I knew." She held him tighter. Silas beside her put his hand on Eli's back. His hand was next to hers there for a moment, both of them holding the same child, and it was not graceful or cinematic. Her elbow was in the wrong place and Eli's boot was pressing on her foot, but it was the realest thing she had ever been inside, and she understood in that moment that this was what she had actually been looking for in those 4 months of letters, under all the words and the hope and the careful construction of expectation. Not the plan. The real thing. It had been here the whole time, 4 miles outside Iron Creek, waiting in a form she hadn't anticipated, which was maybe the only form real things come in. The reception was held at May's hotel, because May had organized it, and May's organizational capabilities were not to be argued with. There was food that was better than it needed to be, and coffee that was strong in the frontier way, and at some point Pete got into a conversation with Reeves about cattle prices that went on for 45 minutes, and seemed to satisfy both parties immensely. Margaret stood near the window with a cup of coffee and watched it all and thought, "I left everything I had. I arrived with $14 and a stack of letters from a man who is already gone. I spent 2 months building something from nothing in a place that owed me nothing." She thought about the shame Nathan Crowley had counted on, the silence, the women who had gone home and carried it. She thought about Dorothy Price's 4th paragraph. "I was ashamed, and that is the thing I am most angry about now." She thought about Ruth Sutter writing her statement at a table in Kansas City, The statement that had run in a newspaper, that had moved through the territory press, that had, according to a letter Walsh had forwarded last month, resulted in an inquiry by the Ohio authorities that had located 2 more women and was beginning to build towards something that might, eventually, constitute a case. Nathan Crowley was in the Utah Territory under what name she didn't know, doing what she didn't know. She had no power over that. She had done what she could do, built what she could build, and sent it into the world and let it go. The thing about justice in the real world, not the courtroom kind, the everyday kind, was that it was slower than you wanted it to be and more partial than you needed it to be, and you rarely got to see it arrive fully formed. What you got was the record, the documented truth, the fact that 3 women's accounts now existed in public form, connected and corroborated with the name Nathan Alderman Crowley on all of them. It wasn't complete. Nothing was complete. But it was real, and it was there, and it would be there tomorrow and the day after, which was more than the silence would have given anyone. May appeared at her elbow. "You're thinking very hard for someone at her own wedding party," May said. "I do that," Margaret said. "I know you do." May looked out at the room, at Silas talking to the ranching family from up north, at Eli underneath the food table doing something with Chester that was definitely not supposed to be happening at an indoor event, at Reeves and Pete still at their corner conversation about cattle. "I want to tell you something," May said. "About when you first walked into my hotel." Margaret looked at her. "You asked me about the room rate and whether there was work in town," May said. "In that order. You didn't say a word about what happened on that platform, not until I said something first. You'd just been left at a train station in a territory you'd never seen, with nothing, and your first move was to ask about the room rate and the job market." She paused. "I've been running this hotel for 16 years. I've seen a lot of people come through that door in difficult situations. Most of them lead with the situation. You led with the next step." She looked at Margaret. "I thought, that one's going to be fine. Whatever she has to get through, she's going to be fine." Margaret looked at her coffee cup. "I wasn't sure of that myself," she said. "I know," May said. "That's what made me sure of it." The party went until the light was completely gone, and then a little further, and when people began to make their goodbyes and head out into the September evening, Silas found her near the door and stood beside her while they said the various goodbyes together. The particular we of 2 people who have moved from separate into something that requires a new pronoun. It felt, she noticed, completely natural. Not momentous. Natural. Which was maybe the best possible sign. On the wagon home, the 4 miles out to the ranch, the road she now knew by the feel of its ruts, the shapes of the land in the dark. Eli fell asleep between them again, same as he had on the way back from Clearwater, same heavy, trusting sleep, same hand loosely on her sleeve. Silas drove. The stars were very clear the way they were in September in Montana, when the summer haze had gone and the air had that first edge of cold, and the sky did its thing where it showed you more of itself than you were quite prepared for. "You ever think," Silas said, "about what would have happened if Crowley had been there that day? At the station?" She thought about it honestly. "I've thought about it," she said. "I think I would have met a very charming man who would have worked very hard to be what the letters said he was. For a while. Long enough to—" She paused. "Long enough to do what he needed to do." She looked at the road. "I don't think I would have been happy. I don't think he was capable of making anyone happy. But I think I would have stayed until I was certain of that, and that might have taken a long time." Silas was quiet for a moment. "He did you a favor by leaving," he said. Not carelessly, carefully, feeling out whether that was the right thing to say. She thought about the platform, the 45 minutes on the bench, $14. "He did," she said. "I hate that he did, but he did." The ranch came into view ahead of them. The lights Pete had left in the windows, the solid shape of the house in the dark, the barn and the garden and the repaired porch railing and all of it, every piece of it, holding its place in the landscape like something that had always been there and always would be. She'd built none of it. It was here before her. But she'd made it into what it was now, or helped make it, with Pete and Dutch and Calhoun and Eli, and the particular man beside her who drove in comfortable silence and had ridden 30 miles twice because she needed him to. She had come here with nothing, less than nothing, with debt and loss, and a stack of letters that turned out to be fiction. What she had now was not what she'd planned. Plans, she had conclusively learned, were largely a way of feeling in control of a future that had already decided what it was going to be regardless. What she had instead was a child who held her sleeve in his sleep, a man who said hard things plainly and didn't pretend they were easy, a hotel owner who was the closest thing to a best friend she'd had in years, ranch hands who fixed things alongside her without being asked, a kitchen that ran the way she wanted it to run, a garden that had come back from near dead and was producing with a kind of defiant enthusiasm she recognized. And somewhere in Kansas City, a woman named Ruth Sutter, who didn't know her but had read about her and had sat down and written a statement that was now in the public record and moving through the world doing the slow, partial, incomplete, real work that truth does when you let it out into the open. Silas pulled the wagon up to the house and stopped. Eli didn't wake. He was a solid, warm weight between them, breathing evenly, completely untroubled. "Home," Silas said quietly. Not to anyone in particular, just putting the word in the air. She looked at the house, at the repaired porch, at the light in the windows Pete had left burning. "Home," she said. She'd left behind a life that fit her wrong. She'd been abandoned by a man who had mistaken her for the kind of person who stays small when she's humiliated. She'd arrived in Iron Creek with $14 and the wrong expectation and a trunk full of letters that added up to nothing. She had stayed anyway, fought anyway, built anyway, from whatever was at hand, the way people build when they've decided that the building matters more than the material. It turned out the material was enough. It always had been. She had just needed to find out what she was made of, and it had taken losing everything she'd planned in order to find out. That was the thing about starting over in a strange place with nothing. It stripped away the things you'd accumulated, the habits, the titles, the small, careful identity you'd constructed over decades in one spot, and left you with just the core of it, just the thing that was actually you, without the decoration. What was left, when she'd been stripped down to it on that platform, was a woman who asked about room rates and job markets instead of crying in public, who fixed porch railings, who kept every letter a con man sent her because she had the instinct, even then, that they might be useful, who taught a 6-year-old boy to read by lamplight because he needed it and she was there and there was no reason to wait, who stayed. The staying was the whole thing, she understood now. Not arriving, not surviving the first days or fighting the legal battle or winning the courtroom. The staying every single ordinary day. The decision to be here, on this piece of land with these people, making the thing that needed making. That was it. That was all of it. Silas lifted Eli and carried him inside, and she followed, closing the door behind her on the September night. And the house held them the way houses hold the people who have chosen them, and the lamp burned steady in the kitchen, and Chester scratched at the door until Pete's voice could be heard somewhere in the dark, telling him firmly to go lie down, and the ranch was quiet and alive around them, and Margaret Rowan, Margaret Boone now, though it would take her a few weeks to remember to write it that way, was home. Not the home she'd planned, the better kind.